Clara Whitmore pressed the wedding bouquet to her chest and did not run, though every muscle in her body begged her to. She had crossed 600 miles of dust and grief to reach this church square, and the man she'd come to marry had just turned to 30 strangers and laughed in her face. "She ain't what I was promised," Nathaniel Brooks announced, loud enough for the back row. The crowd tittered. Clara's knuckles went white around the flowers. And from the far edge of the street, a low, rough voice cut clean through the laughter. "That's no way to treat a lady." Before we go on, if you love stories about strong women who rise from the ashes and the good men who stand beside them, take a moment to subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far Clara's story travels tonight. Now let's begin. The wagon had rolled into Red Hollow, Montana just after noon, and Clara Whitmore had smoothed her skirt 4 times before she let the driver help her down. She was 31 years old. She had $11 sewn into the hem of her dress, a leather case of everything she owned in this world, and a folded letter she had read so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. "Come to Red Hollow before the summer's out," the letter said in Nathaniel Brooks's careful hand. "A man ought not build a life alone. I believe we could make something honest together." She had believed it too. "You Miss Whitmore?" the driver asked, setting her case down in the road. "I am," she said. "Then I reckon that's your fella yonder?" He nodded toward the church, toward a knot of people gathered in the square, and touched his hat. "Good luck to you, ma'am." Clara had not needed luck. She had needed a chance. That was all she'd ever asked of anyone. She walked toward the church with her back straight and her chin level, the way her mother had taught her, before the fever took the whole family and left Clara the only one standing. She wore the one fine dress she owned, gray with a bit of white lace at the collar, mended twice at the cuff where no one would notice. Her hair was pinned up neat. Her hands folded around a bunch of prairie wildflowers she'd picked at the last watering stop did not shake. Not yet. Nathaniel Brooks was taller than she'd pictured and better dressed. He stood on the church steps in a dark coat, his boots shined, his jaw clean-shaved, and beside him stood a young woman in silk the color of butter. A parasol tilted just so against the sun. Clara slowed. The young woman said something behind her gloved hand, and Nathaniel laughed, and it was not a kind laugh. "Mr. Brooks," Clara said, stopping at the foot of the steps. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that later when she remembered it. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I've come a long way to meet you." For a moment, he only looked at her. Looked her up and down the gray dress, the mended cuff, the sunburn across the bridge of her nose from 3 days on the open road. And whatever he saw, it made the corner of his mouth pull sideways. "You're Clara," he said. "I am. Huh." He glanced at the woman in silk beside him. "She's older than the letters let on." The woman laughed into her glove. Clara felt the first cold drop of it then, that feeling like ice water down the spine, but she held her ground. "I wrote you honest," she said. "Every word of it. I told you I was 31. I told you I had nothing but my 2 hands and a willing heart." "You did," Nathaniel agreed, and he came down 1 step slow, so the whole square could see him do it. Folks had begun to drift closer. A wedding was an event in a town like Red Hollow, and word had gone round that the mail-order bride was coming in on the noon wagon. 30, maybe 40 people stood watching now, wives and shopkeepers and children with dust on their bare feet. "I did write it honest," Nathaniel said louder now, playing to them. "And I'll tell you what, folks, I built a picture in my head. A man does. You read a woman's letters, you imagine something fine." He gestured at Clara with an open hand like a man showing off livestock that had disappointed him. "This ain't it." The laughter came in a ripple through the crowd. Clara's face went hot. "Mr. Brooks." "Nathaniel," said the woman in silk, sweetly laying a hand on his arm. "Don't be cruel." "I ain't being cruel, Delphine. I'm being truthful." He turned back to Clara, and his voice dropped into something almost gentle, which was worse than the shouting. "Look, I'll be a gentleman about it. I'll pay your fare back to wherever it is you came from. Ain't no shame in a mistake long as a man fixes it quick. But I ain't marrying you. I got standards to consider. A man in my position." He glanced back at Delphine Carver, at the silk at the parasol, and Clara understood the whole shape of it in a single sick heartbeat. A man in my position can do a good deal better than a worn-out spinster off the back of a wagon. Somebody in the crowd said, "Ooh, the way you do at a schoolyard fight." Clara stood very still. She had buried her mother. She had buried her father and both her brothers one after another in a single hard winter, and dug the graves herself when the ground was still half froze because there was no one left to help her. She had cleaned other people's houses and mended other people's clothes and gone hungry so a stranger's children could eat, and through all of it, she had told herself the same thing. A person's worth ain't decided by how the world treats them. It's decided by how they carry it. She lifted her chin. "You wrote me 11 letters, Mr. Brooks," she said, and her voice did not break, though the whole square went quiet to hear it. 11. You told me about your land and your plans. You told me you were lonesome. You asked me to leave the only home I had ever known and cross 600 miles on your word. She took a breath. If you'd changed your mind, a decent man would have written and said so. He'd have spared me the journey and spared me this. Her hand tightened on the wildflowers. But you waited. You let me come all this way, so you could do it in front of everybody. One team. Joel? D. For just a second, something flickered behind Nathaniel's eyes. Shame, maybe, or the memory of the man he'd pretended to be in those letters. Then Delphine Carver murmured something, and he swallowed it down, and he laughed. "Listen to her," he said to the crowd. "Talks real pretty, don't she? Pity that's all she's got." He flicked his fingers toward her case in the road. "Go on now. Wagon comes back through Thursday. You can wait at the boarding house. I'll settle the bill." And he turned his back on her. He turned his back on her in front of the whole town, and offered his arm to Delphine Carver, and the two of them started up the church steps as if Clara Whitmore had already ceased to exist. Clara stood alone in the dirt. 30 faces watched her, and not one of them spoke. Not the minister in his black coat who had come out to perform a wedding and now stood frozen in the doorway. Not the shopkeeper's wife with her hand pressed to her mouth. Not the men who'd shaken Nathaniel's hand that morning and called him a lucky fellow. They watched her the way people watch a house burn when there's nothing to be done. Half horror and half hunger, and the silence pressed down on Clara harder than any of Nathaniel's words had. The tears came up hot behind her eyes. She fought them. She would not cry, not here, not for them. She bent slow and careful and picked up her leather case. And that was when the voice came from behind the crowd. "That's no way to treat a lady." It was not loud. That was the strange thing about it. It didn't need to be. It was low and rough as gravel down a wash. The voice of a man who did not spend words freely, and so spent them with weight, and it landed in the square like a stone dropped in still water. The whole crowd turned. At the edge of the street where the buildings gave way to the long road up toward the mountains, a man sat on a big roan horse. He'd come in so quiet, nobody had marked him. He was maybe 8 and 30, lean and hard-used, with a dark growth of beard and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. His coat was rough oilcloth, his boots worn near through, and a long rifle rode in a scabbard at his knee. Everything about him said, mountain said, solitude, said a man who came to town twice a year for salt and powder and wanted nothing from anybody. The crowd knew him. Clara could see it in the way they drew back a little. "Hayes," somebody muttered. Garrick Hayes swung down off the roan without hurry. His boots hit the dirt, and he looped the reins over the hitching rail, and he crossed the square with the unbothered gait of a man walking into his own barn. Nathaniel had stopped on the church steps. He turned. "This ain't your affair, Hayes." "No?" Garrick agreed. He came to a stop a few feet from Clara, but he didn't look at her. He looked at Nathaniel. "Reckon it ain't." "Then keep on riding." Garrick tipped his hat back with one thumb. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that folks began to shift on their feet. "I come down for salt," he said at last. Was gonna get it and go. Don't much care for town. He let that sit. But I got to the top of the street just in time to hear a man tell 30 people that a woman who crossed 600 miles on his word ain't worth the dirt she's standing in. He turned his head slow and looked at Nathaniel full on for the first time, and I find I can't quite ride off on that. She's a stranger to you. She's a stranger to every soul in this square, Garrick said. That's what's turning my stomach. A murmur went through the crowd. Nathaniel came back down the steps, color rising in his face. Delphine Carver's parasol had drooped. She was watching now with sharp, interested eyes. You want to lecture me, Hayes? You a man that lives in a hole in the mountain and talks to his mule 'cause he ain't got nobody else. You want to tell me about? I don't want to tell you anything, Garrick said. I quit expecting men like you to learn a long time ago. He said it flat without heat, and somehow that made it worse. But I'll say this so the whole town hears it, since the whole town's here. He raised his voice only a little, and it carried to the last row. Respect ain't something you hand a person after they've bled to earn it. A decent man gives it at the start. He gives it to a stranger stepping off a wagon before he knows one blessed thing about her, because that's the floor, mister. That's the least you owe another living soul. He nodded once toward Clara without looking at her. This woman came here in good faith. You met her good faith with a show. And every one of you. Now he did turn, and his Creekwater eyes went across the crowd, the shopkeeper, the minister, the wives, the men who'd shaken Nathaniel's hand. Every one of you stood and watched and let him. Nobody answered. The shopkeeper's wife lowered her hand from her mouth. The minister looked down at his own boots. Clara stood between them, her case in one hand and the wildflowers crushed in the other, and for the first time since the wagon had rolled in, she felt something other than shame. She didn't have a name for it yet. It sat in her chest like a coal. Nathaniel's jaw worked. He'd been made small in front of the woman he was trying to impress, and Clara watched him decide to get some of his size back, the only way a small man knows how. You know what? He said, thin and mean. Maybe you two deserve each other, the mountain hermit and the reject bride. He barked a laugh. Go on, Hayes. Take her up your mountain. Nobody down here wants her. It should have landed hard. It was meant to. But Clara had already found the coal in her chest, and she had spent a whole life learning how to breathe on a coal until it gave off heat. She set her case down again. She stepped past Garrick Hayes, out into the middle of the square, where every eye could reach her, and she looked at Nathaniel Brooks, and her voice, when it came, was clear as a struck bell. You want to know the truth of it, Mr. Brooks, she said. You've done me a kindness today, though you never meant to. Nathaniel blinked. What? You've shown me exactly the kind of man you are, Clara said, before I gave you a single year of my life. Before I cooked your meals and mended your shirts and lay awake wondering why you'd gone cold. Before I turned into some woman standing in a doorway, watching you tip your hat to Miss Carver there, and telling myself it didn't mean a thing. She shook her head slowly. I came 600 miles hoping to find a good man. And instead, I found out, in the space of 5 minutes and in front of God and all these people, that you are not one. She let that hang. That's not my shame, sir. That's yours. And you'll be wearing it long after I'm gone. The square was so quiet, Clara could hear the roan horse blow air through its lips at the rail. Delphine Carver was no longer smiling. Nathaniel opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and found, as men like him always do in the end, that he had nothing. Then a woman's voice came out of the crowd, older, cracked with age. The shopkeeper's wife, a heavy woman in a faded blue calico, stepped forward with her chin trembling. He's right, she said, and it took Clara a second to realize she meant Garrick. That mountain man's right, and shame on us. She looked around at her neighbors, her voice climbing. We stood here and let it happen, and some of us laughed. This poor girl comes into town with nothing but a suitcase and her Sunday dress, and we treated her like a horse gone lame. She turned to Clara, and her eyes were wet. I'm sorry, miss. God forgive me, I'm sorry. And then it broke the way a thaw breaks a river. Ain't right, a man muttered. Never was. Nathaniel Brooks, your daddy'd be ashamed, said another. You ought to be horsewhipped talking to a lady so. The tide had turned all at once the way a crowd will, and Nathaniel stood in the middle of it with his fine coat and his shined boots, and watched the whole town's regard drain out of him like water from a cracked jug. He looked to Delphine Carver for help, and Delphine Carver had discovered a sudden fascination with the tips of her own gloves. This is, Nathaniel sputtered. This is my wedding day. I'm the injured party here. I'm the one who— You ain't injured, Garrick said quietly. You're just found out. Ain't the same thing, though. I grant they feel alike. Nathaniel's face went white, then red. He took a step toward Garrick, fists balling, and the whole square drew a breath. Garrick didn't move. He didn't raise a hand or reach for the rifle, or so much as shift his weight. He just stood there, easy and still, and looked at Nathaniel Brooks with those flat creekwater eyes, and something in that stillness stopped Nathaniel cold 2 paces off. Some old animal knowing that told him the quiet man was not a man to put hands on. Go on and swing, Garrick said mildly. If it'll make you feel like the man you was pretending to be 5 minutes ago. But I'll tell you honest, mister, it won't. You'll just have done one more thing in front of the whole town you'll wish you hadn't. For a long, taut moment, nobody breathed. Then Nathaniel Brooks did the second most cowardly thing Clara saw him do that day. He backed down. He lowered his fists and forced a laugh that fooled nobody and said, Ain't worth the trouble. Ain't worth my time. He jabbed a finger at Clara. You want her, Hayes, she's yours. Charity case for a charity case. And he spun on his heel and stalked up the church steps and through the doors and was gone. And Delphine Carver gathered her butter-colored skirts and hurried after him without a backward glance, and the church door banged shut behind the both of them. Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The crowd began to loosen, to murmur, to disperse the way crowds do when the show is over. But it was different now. As the townsfolk passed her, they didn't hurry by with their eyes down. The shopkeeper's wife pressed Clara's hand between both of hers. A farmer touched his hat brim and said low, Ma'am? A little girl with dust on her feet offered Clara a wilted dandelion she'd been holding, and Clara took it, and it undid her more than all Nathaniel's cruelty had. That one small flower from one small stranger, and she had to blink hard and fast to keep the tears where they belonged. And then it was just the two of them in the emptying square. Clara Whitmore and the mountain man, and her case in the dirt between them. Garrick Hayes bent, picked up her case as if it weighed nothing, and set it upright by her feet. Then he stepped back a respectful distance and took off his hat and held it against his chest with both hands, and Clara saw that under the trail dust and the hard years, he was not so much older than she was, and that his eyes were not flat at all when he looked at her direct. They were tired. And they were kind. Ma'am, he said, I got no business speaking for you, and I won't. What you said to him just now, that was yours, and it was fine. Finest thing I've heard said in this town in 10 years. He turned his hat in his hands. I only stopped what I couldn't ride past. I ain't asking you for a thing. I know, Clara said softly. That's why I could hear you. He nodded as if that made sense to him. You got somewhere to go? He asked. Kin. Someone back home you can wire. And there it was. The question she'd been dreading since the wagon rolled in. The question whose true answer she'd been carrying like a stone in her stomach for a year. Clara looked down at the dandelion in her hand. No, she said. No kin. No home either. She lifted her eyes to his because she had decided long ago that she would speak the truth of her life plain and take whatever came. I'm not being poor-mouthed about it, Mr. Hayes. I want you to understand me. There is no wire I can send. There is no town waiting for me. The fever took my mother and my father and both my brothers 3 winters back, all inside 2 months, and I dug their graves myself because there wasn't a soul left to help. I sold the farm to pay what they owed. I cleaned houses in Missouri 2 years to get square with the world. Her voice was steady, but it cost her. When Mr. Brooks' letters came, I thought the good Lord had finally decided I'd paid enough. I thought I was owed a little kindness." She let out a breath that shook only at the very end. "I reckon I thought wrong. There's no place for me to go back to. There never was. That's the truth of it." Mid. Garrick Hayes stood quiet a long while. When he spoke, he didn't offer pity, and Clara was grateful because pity would have broken her where cruelty hadn't. "My mother died when I was 9, he said. Pa a few years after. I've been on my own since I was a boy near enough. I know how it sits being the last one standing. It's a particular kind of alone." He looked off toward the mountains blue and enormous at the end of the street. "Folks think a man like me lives up there 'cause I hate people. It ain't that. I just got tired of watching people be the way that fella was to you just now." He put his hat back on. "The mountain don't lie to you. Weather'll kill you, but it won't shame you. There's a comfort in that a body don't understand till they've had enough of the other kind." Bon, auto amistad. "I think I might understand it already," Clara said. "After today." Something that was almost a smile moved at the corner of the mountain man's mouth. "I reckon you might," he said. The last of the townsfolk had gone. The square was near empty now, gold with the long afternoon light, and Clara stood beside her one leather case, with $11 sewn in her hem and a wilted dandelion in her fist, and no earthly idea what she would do when the sun went down. She was not afraid, though. That was the thing she noticed standing there. She had been afraid for 3 years, one long, unbroken fear stretching from the winter of the graves clear to the church steps of Red Hollow. And now, strangely, the fear had gone quiet. Because a stranger had ridden down off a mountain and said 4 words in a public square when everybody else had said nothing at all. That's no way to treat a lady. She would carry those 4 words the rest of her life. She knew it already, the way you know a thing in your bones before your mind catches up. Whatever came next, wherever she ended up, she would never again believe the lie the world had spent 3 years teaching her the lie Nathaniel Brooks had shouted at 30 people not an hour ago. That she was worth nothing. She was worth something. A quiet man on a roan horse had proven it in front of the whole town, not with a gift, not with a rescue, but simply by refusing to look away. "Mr. Hayes," Clara said. "Ma'am, I don't rightly know what happens to me now." She looked up at him level and clear-eyed, the sunburn bright across her nose. "But I want you to know that whatever it is, I'll remember what you did today till the day I die. You didn't owe me a thing. You didn't know me from a fence post. And you stood up anyway." Her voice caught just once, and she let it because some things a person shouldn't have to say without their voice shaking. "In 3 years, you're the first one who did." Garrick Hayes looked at her for a long moment. This woman in a mended gray dress who'd crossed 600 miles to be laughed at and had answered it with more grace than the whole town of Red Hollow could muster between them. Then he touched his hat brim, the way a man does, to say he means a thing honest. "Ma'am," he said, "the way I see it, the whole world's been treating you like you owe it something, like you got to earn the right to be stood up for." He shook his head slowly. "You don't. You never did. And any man that told you different was lying to make himself feel bigger." He turned and walked back toward the roan at the rail, and Clara thought for one hollow moment that he was leaving, that the kindness was over, and the sun was going down, and she was alone again after all. But at the hitching rail he stopped. He stood with his hand on the roan's neck, his back to her, and he was quiet the way he'd been quiet in the square before he spoke the quiet of a man weighing words before he spent them. Then he turned around. "There's a boarding house yonder," he said. "Widow Ames keeps it. She's a fair woman, and she'll give you a clean bed and not ask you a thing you don't want to answer." He paused. "That's the sensible thing. The safe thing. Wagon comes Thursday like he said, and you can ride it wherever the road takes you, and put this whole cursed town behind you, and I'd not blame you one bit." Clara waited. She'd learned in the space of a single afternoon that this man did not waste his words, and that when he stopped, it was because a bigger word was coming. "But," Garrick Hayes said, and the low sun sat gold on the mountains at the end of the street, and the dandelion trembled in Clara Whitmore's hand, And for the first time in 3 long years, she found that she was leaning forward to hear what a man would say next, not with dread in her heart, but with something that felt against all reason and all the hard evidence of her life, a great deal like hope. But Garrick Hayes said, "I got a cabin up the mountain. 2 rooms. One of 'em I don't use for much, but storing hides and pretending I'll get around to fixing the roof." He kept his hand on the roan's neck, and he did not look at her while he said it the way a proud man will look anywhere but at the person he's offering something to, so as not to make it a burden. "It ain't fine. It ain't warm as a house in town, but it's got a door that locks from the inside, and it's got no Nathaniel Brooks in it, and no Delphine Carver, and nobody who'll laugh at you for a dress." He paused. "You're welcome to it. Long as you need. Not as a servant, not as a wife, not as anything, but a body that deserves a floor to stand on while she figures out her next step. That's all it is. I want that plain between us before you answer." For a moment, Clara couldn't speak at all. She had braced herself standing there in the emptying square for one of 2 things. She'd braced for the mountain man to ride off kindness spent and leave her to the boarding house and the Thursday wagon and the long gray rest of a life spent being nobodies. Or she'd braced for the other thing, the thing men like Nathaniel taught a woman to expect, the offer with the hook hid inside it, the roof that came with a price you paid in the dark. This was neither. And she found she didn't know how to stand inside a kindness that asked for nothing back. It was like being handed something in a language she'd forgotten she spoke. "Mr. Hayes," she said carefully, "you don't know me." "No, ma'am." "I could be anybody. A thief, a liar, a woman running from something worse than a cruel groom." She lifted her chin. "You'd take a stranger up your own mountain, into your own home, on the word of nothing." Garrick considered that a long moment. Then, for the first time since he'd swung down off the roan, something like a real smile touched his face, and it changed him. Took 10 hard years off him all at once. "Ma'am," he said, "an hour ago you stood in that dirt and told a lying coward the truth of himself in front of the whole town, and you never once raised your voice, nor stooped to his level. A thief don't do that. A liar don't do that. Whatever you are, I watched you be it, and I'd take my chances." He shrugged. "Besides, I got a rifle and I sleep light. If you turn out to be an outlaw, I reckon I'll manage." And Clara Whitmore laughed. It came up out of her sudden and unbidden, the first laugh in longer than she could rightly recall, and it surprised her so much she pressed her hand to her mouth. The sound of it seemed to please the mountain man more than anything else could have, though all he did was nod satisfied as though he'd got some answer he'd been fishing for. But she did not say yes. Not yet, because a woman who has been broken once by trusting a man's letters does not unbreak herself by trusting a second man's mouth, no matter how kind the mouth. Clara had learned that lesson in the coldest school there was, and she did not intend to unlearn it in an afternoon. "I'll think on it," she said. "I mean no insult by it, but I'll not be swept off my feet again by pretty words, not even good ones. I've had enough of trusting a stranger sight unseen to last me my whole life." Garrick's smile widened a fraction. "Ma'am, that is the most sensible thing anybody's said to me in a decade. You think on it as long as you like. Widow Ames'll have a room. I'll be at the Mercantile getting my salt come morning, and if you've a mind, you can find me there, and tell me your answer. And if you don't come," he touched his hat brim, "then I wish you nothing but easier roads than the one that brought you here." He turned to mount up. "Mr. Hayes." He stopped one boot in the stirrup. "Why?" Clara said. "That's what I can't get past. You could have got your salt and gone home and never thought on it again. No one would have faulted you. No one would have even known. So why'd you get down off that horse? Garrick stood there with his boot in the stirrup and the low sun on his face, and Clara watched him decide whether to give her the easy answer or the true one. She was getting to know already that he had both, and that he weighed which to spend the same way he weighed everything. "Had a sister," he said at last, quiet, "younger 'n me. When our folks passed, she got sent one way, and I got sent another on account of nobody wanting to take on 2 mouths at once. She was 7. I was 11. He looked off toward the mountains. Family that took her wasn't kind. I didn't know it for years because I was 3 counties off and a boy myself with no way to get to her. By the time I was grown enough to go looking, she was in the ground. Fever, they said. But the neighbors told me different. Told me she'd been worked half to death and fed less than the hogs, and nobody in that whole town said a word, 'cause it weren't their affair. His jaw tightened. Every soul in that town watched a little girl get treated like she was worth nothing, and every one of them kept their eyes on their own supper. He looked back at Clara. So when I got to the top of that street just now and saw 30 people watching a woman get treated like she was worth nothing and not one of them saying a word. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. I made a promise to a dead girl a long time ago, ma'am. I don't get to watch it happen twice. And then he swung up onto the roan and touched his hat and rode off up the long road toward the blue mountains without another word. And Clara Whitmore stood in the gold and emptying square with a wilted dandelion in her fist, and her whole idea of what a man could be turned clean over on its head. She did not sleep much that night at Widow Ames's boarding house. The widow was exactly as Garrick had said. A broad, plain-spoken woman with flour on her apron, who took one look at Clara in the doorway and said, "You're the wagon bride Brooks made a fool of himself over. Whole town's talking. Come in, child, supper's on, and you'll not pay me a nickel for it, and I'll hear no argument." And Clara, too worn out to argue, had eaten the first hot meal she'd had in 4 days and let the widow fuss over her, and it was only later, lying awake in the narrow, clean bed with the door locked, that the widow's other words came back to her. Because the widow had said other things too over the washing up. "You'd be wise to steer clear of that Delphine Carver," Widow Ames had said, scrubbing a pot. "And her daddy worse. Silas Carver. Owns the bank, owns the assay office, owns half the paper in this valley, and aims to own the other half before he's through." She'd said it low, glancing at the window, as though the man might be standing in it. "Folks around here been losing their land 2-3 years now. Good land been in families since before the war. They go into Carver's bank to renew a note, and somehow the papers ain't quite what they thought they signed. And next thing you know, the land's Carver's and the family's on the road with what they can carry." She'd shaken her head. "And Nathaniel Brooks is Carver's man now. Been sniffing after Delphine and after her daddy's money both. That's why he threw you over so public, child. Weren't about your dress. It was about showing Silas Carver he'd cast his lot with the Carvers, and not with some poor, honest bride come to make an honest home. A man like Nathaniel don't do a cruelty for no reason. He does it to be seen doing it. Somebody was meant to see." Clara had turned that over and over in the dark until the window went from black to gray. It changed things knowing it. It didn't make the humiliation hurt less, but it made it hurt different. Because if Widow Ames was right, then Clara had never really had a chance at all. She'd been a piece on a board she couldn't see moved and then swept off, and her only crime had been believing 11 letters from a man who'd needed a public sacrifice to prove his loyalty to richer folks. And there was something else in it too. Something that pricked at the back of Clara's mind, like a splinter she couldn't find. Somehow, the papers ain't quite what they thought they signed. Clara knew about papers. She'd never told a soul in Red Hollow, and she didn't intend to. But before the fever took her family before the graves and the selling, and the 2 years of cleaning other women's floors, Clara Whitmore had kept the books for her father's farm, and 3 of their neighbors besides. She had a head for figures that her father had called a waste in a girl, and used anyway, because it was the best head for figures in the county, and everyone knew it. She could read a ledger like a preacher reads scripture. She could look at a column of numbers and tell you where the lie was in it the same way a hound can tell you where the rabbit went. It was the one thing she'd never lost through all of it. The fever couldn't take it, and the creditors couldn't sell it, and Nathaniel Brooks couldn't laugh it out of her. Somehow the papers ain't quite what they thought they signed. She lay awake, and she thought I would like to see those papers. And then she thought, with a small cold shock of clarity, sitting up straight in the narrow bed, as the dawn came gray in the window. No. I would like to get as far from Silas Carver and his papers and this whole poisoned town as a body can get. Which was, she realized, the answer to Garrick Hayes's offer. She found him at the mercantile just after sunup, exactly where he'd said he'd be standing at the counter with a sack of salt and a coil of new rope and a look on his face like a man enduring a necessary evil. He turned when the bell over the door rang, and when he saw it was her, something eased in his shoulders that he tried to hide and didn't quite manage. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Hayes?" Clara stood in the doorway with her case in her hand, dressed and pinned and steady. "I've thought on it. And I've got some conditions," she said. "I'll not go up any man's mountain on charity, not even yours. So it's this way or it's not at all. I'll cook, I'll mend, I'll keep whatever books you've got, and I'd wager they need keeping, and I'll earn my keep every single day. I'm under your roof, and the first time you treat me as anything but a woman paying her own way, I'll walk back down that mountain if I have to do it in the dark." She lifted her chin. "I've had enough of being given things by men. I'll take a fair trade or I'll take nothing. Those are my terms." Garrick Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Then he stuck out his hand, rough and scarred and brown as saddle leather. "Ma'am," he said, "that's the best deal anybody's offered me in 20 years. Shake on it." And Clara Whitmore shook the hand of the mountain man there in the mercantile with the storekeep, pretending not to gawp, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight as a fist for 3 long years came loose just a little, just enough to breathe around. The storekeep, a nervous thin man named Pettibone, rang up Garrick's salt and rope with fingers that fumbled, and Clara caught him stealing looks at her, and she thought nothing of it until they were nearly out the door, and the man blurted out, Miss Whitmore, is it?" Clara turned. "It is." Pettibone glanced past her out the window, up and down the street, the exact way Widow Ames had glanced at her own window the night before, and Clara felt the splinter prick again. "You'd do well to be gone from town quick," Pettibone said low and fast. "Mr. Carver come by this morning first thing asking after you, asking where you'd got to, asking real particular." He swallowed. "I told him you'd taken a room at the widow's. God forgive me, I didn't know it'd matter. But when a man like Silas Carver comes asking particular after a body who ought to be nothing to him—" He didn't finish. He looked sick. "Just go quick, miss, that's all. And you didn't hear it from me." Out in the street, Clara stopped walking. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "why would Silas Carver be asking after me?" Garrick had gone very still beside her, the salt sack over one shoulder. He was looking down the street toward the bank, a big, handsome, false-fronted building that lorded over the whole of Red Hollow, and his Creekwater eyes had gone flat and careful again. "I don't know," he said slowly. "But I'll tell you what I do know. Silas Carver don't waste a minute of his morning on a thing that don't profit him. And a jilted wagon bride ought to be about the least profitable thing in this whole territory." He shifted the salt on his shoulder. "Which means you ain't what he thinks you are. Or you know something he don't want known. Or—" He stopped. "Or what?" "Or you got something he wants," Garrick said quietly. "You come here to marry a man. You got any papers on you? Any deed, any claim, any letter with a name on it worth money." And Clara's blood went cold in her veins, because she did. She had the letter. Nathaniel's letter, the 11th and last one, the one she'd read till the creases went soft. And it wasn't the words in it that mattered, she realized now, standing frozen in the street. It was the other thing, the thing she'd tucked inside it, because she'd had no safer place, the thing her dying father had pressed into her hand along with his blessing on the last clear night before the fever took his wits. "My father's claim," she whispered, "to land in Montana Territory. He filed on it years back before we ever settled in Missouri. He never worked it, never sold it, held on to the paper, case times ever got hard enough that we'd need to pull up stakes and start over somewhere fresh." She looked up at Garrick, and her voice had gone thin. "It's 160 acres. On the Musselshell. I never gave it a thought. I've been carrying it 3 years like it was nothing but a keepsake of him. I'm Mr. Hayes. I didn't even mean to bring it to Red Hollow. It's just always been in with the letter, and I never—" "Where's this land?" Garrick's voice had sharpened. "You know exactly. The Musselshell River bottoms. Section marked on the paper. Why?" Garrick Hayes closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, There was something grim in them that Clara hadn't seen before, not even when he'd faced down Nathaniel in the square. "'Cause the Muscle Shell Bottoms is where Silas Carver's been buying up every acre he can lay his hands on," he said. "Been at it 2 years. Word is the railroad's coming through, and whoever owns that river bottom when it does is gonna be richer than God. Carver's got most of it. He's been squeezing folks off their land to get the rest." He looked at her, and the grim thing in his eyes had turned to something almost like fear, which was a strange thing to see on a man like him. "And you just rode into his town, Miss Whitmore, holding legal claim to 160 acres of the exact ground he needs. Filed and proved years before he ever started buying. Which means your paper trumps every deed he's got." He let out a slow breath. "You ain't a jilted bride to Silas Carver. You're the one thing standing between him and a fortune, and I'd bet my roan that Nathaniel Brooks knew it. I'd bet that's the real reason he wrote you 11 letters and got you all the way out here." The street seemed to tilt under Clara's feet. "He knew," she said numbly. "Nathaniel knew about the claim. I mentioned it in one of my letters. I told him about Pa's old land on the Muscle Shell. Told him maybe someday we could work it together. Thought it'd please him to know I brought something to the marriage besides 2 empty hands." She pressed her fingers to her mouth. "Oh, Lord, that's why he answered. That's why he ever wrote me back at all. It was never me. It was the land. He was going to marry me and take the claim and hand it to Carver, and I'd have signed it over without a second thought because I'd have trusted my own husband." "And when Carver seen you off the wagon," Garrick said grimly, "and Nathaniel got word Delphine's daddy'd pay him more to marry into the family direct, he threw me over," Clara finished, and a terrible laugh broke out of her bitter as gall. "He threw me over, but he didn't reckon on losing the claim doing it. He thought I'd take the Thursday wagon and vanish, and the paper with me forgotten. And instead, I'm still here, still holding it." She looked up at Garrick with dawning horror. "Which means the only thing between Silas Carver and everything he's schemed 2 years for is a poor woman with no kin, no friends, and no protection, who nobody in this whole territory would miss." The two of them stood in the middle of the street, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then Garrick Hayes took her case out of her hand. "We're leaving," he said. "Now, this minute. You can walk to my horse, or I can carry you. But you ain't standing in Silas Carver's street one more breath than you have to." He was already moving fast, and Clara had to near run to keep up with him. "Widow Ames, get your things, everything, the letter, the claim. It's all in the case. I never let it out of my sight." "Good." They reached the roan, and Garrick was already lashing her case behind the saddle with the new rope, his hands quick and sure. "We ride up the mountain, we get you behind a door that locks, and then we sit down and we think, 'cause a man like Carver don't send hired guns before he's tried the cheaper ways first. He'll try to buy the claim. He'll try to scare you into signing. And when neither of those works, he'll try worse," Clara said. "He'll try worse." Garrick swung up into the saddle and reached down a hand to her. "Can you ride behind?" Clara looked at the offered hand. And for one heartbeat, standing in Silas Carver's street with her whole life turned inside out for the second time. In a day, she felt the old fear rise up. The fear that said, don't trust, don't reach the last man you trusted, sold you for a river bottom. She felt it plain. But she looked past the hand to the man it belonged to, the man who'd buried a promise to a dead sister and kept it 2 counties and 20 years later for a stranger in a mended dress. And she found that the fear, for once, could not get its grip. She took his hand. He pulled her up behind him, light as a saddlebag. And she got her arms around his middle, and the roan turned its nose toward the mountains, and Garrick Hayes clicked his tongue, and they were moving out of Red Hollow and up the long climbing road. And Clara did not look back at the church square, where a groom had laughed at her, nor at the bank, where a rich man was even now asking particular questions, nor at any of it. She looked ahead at the blue peaks rising, and she held on to the mountain man, and behind them the town fell away. They did not speak much on the ride up. It was steep, and the roan needed its wind, and there was a listening quality to the way Garrick carried himself, his head turning now and again to the trees, that told Clara he was watching their back trail. But once near the top where the road narrowed to a track and the pines closed in dark and cool on either side, he spoke over his shoulder. "You scared?" Clara considered the true answer. "Yes," she said, "but not the way I was yesterday. Yesterday I was scared of being nothing. Today I'm scared of a man with money and no scruples, and that's a plain kind of scared. There's a shape to it. A body can fight a thing that has a shape." She tightened her arms a little. "Being nothing, there's no fighting that. That's the worst scared there is, and I don't feel it anymore, not since a mountain man got down off his horse." Garrick was quiet a while. "You keep saying that," he said finally, "about me getting down off the horse, like it was a big thing. It was. It weren't. Any decent man—" "No," Clara said, and she said it firm enough that he fell silent. "Don't you do that. Don't you tell me it was nothing that any decent man would have, because I stood in that square and I counted Mr. Hayes. 30-some decent men and women, and every last one of them stood there with their mouths shut. You want to know how many decent people it takes to do the decent thing?" Her voice caught. "Just one. Just one who'll actually do it. And they're rarer than gold. So don't you ever tell me it was nothing. It was the only something in that whole town." The cabin when they reached it was small and rough, and set in a clearing high on the shoulder of the mountain, with a view down the whole valley that took Clara's breath. It had one room mostly, and a lean-to second room, a stone chimney, a wood shingle roof that did indeed sag on one corner, and a stout door with an iron bar. There was a corral, a shed, a woodpile stacked high and neat as a church wall, and everywhere the marks of a man who lived alone and did every single thing himself, and did most of it well. Garrick got her down, saw her inside, barred the door, and only then, with the bar dropped and the window shuttered, did some of the tension go out of him. "You'll take the lean-to room," he said. "It ain't much, but I'll clear the hides out today, and there's a good bed frame in there, and I'll fetch you fresh ticking. Door don't lock, but I'll fix a bar on it before nightfall so you can bolt it from the inside. I don't want you lying awake worried on my account. You lock yourself in and you sleep sound. You hear?" "I hear," Clara said softly. And then, because she had spent 3 years learning to be useful the instant she entered any house, because usefulness was the only currency she'd had to buy her way in the world, she rolled up her sleeves and looked around the rough cabin and said, "Now, where do you keep your flour, and when did you last eat something that weren't jerked or burnt?" Garrick blinked at her. "Ma'am, you don't got to. I've got to earn my keep or I've got to leave, and I'm not leaving, so hand me that flour." She was already reaching for the sack. "We shook on it, Mr. Hayes. A fair trade or nothing. I'll not have you making me a charity case after all, not even by being kind about it. Now, flour." Something moved across Garrick Hayes's weathered face that Clara couldn't quite read, and he handed her the flour, and he watched her tie back her sleeves and set to work in his kitchen, like she'd been born to it, and he said quiet more to himself than to her, "Well, all right then." The first days were careful days. They moved around each other like two creatures that had lived too long alone and forgot how to share a space polite and wary and quick to apologize. Clara cooked and cleaned the cabin till it near shone, and turned up her nose at the state of things, and set them to rights in a way that had Garrick coming in from the corral and stopping dead in the door, blinking, hardly recognizing his own home. She found his ledger, a battered thing where he kept his hides and his sales and his stores, and she saw in one look that he'd been undercharging the fur buyer in town by near a third for years, too proud or too solitary to argue over prices. And she fixed his figures and showed him what he was owed, and watched his jaw drop. That thieving Garrick stared at the ledger. "He's been robbing me blind 6 years. He's been counting on you not wanting to fuss," Clara said crisply. "Men like that always do. Next time you go to town you take this." She tapped the page. "And you don't say a word. You just lay it on the counter and you point. He'll pay you square, or you'll take your hides to Miles City, and he knows it, and he'll fold before you finish pointing." She closed the ledger. "You don't need to be loud to be right, Mr. Hayes. You just need to have the figures. I learned that a long time ago." Garrick looked at her with a new kind of respect. "You're a wonder with numbers," he said. "I'm the best there ever was with numbers," Clara said, matter of fact. No pride in it, just truth. Kept my father's books from the time I was 12. Kept 3 neighbors besides. My pa said it was a waste in a girl, and he used me anyway, every harvest, every settling up, 'cause there weren't a soul in the county could catch a cheat quicker than me." Her face went a little wistful. "It's the one thing the world never managed to take off me. They took the farm and the family and near took my hope. But they couldn't take the numbers. The numbers were always mine. On key." And she saw Garrick file that away, the way he filed everything. And she didn't yet understand why her heart lifted a little at being seen like that, at being known for the sharpest thing in her instead of the poorest. It was on the 4th day that the first trouble came. Clara was hanging wash on the line Garrick had strung between 2 pines, and Garrick was up on the sagging corner of the roof at last hammer in hand, when the roan lifted its head in the corral and blew and pawed, and Garrick went still on the roof hammer frozen mid-swing. "Get inside," he said. Low, not looking at her. "Now, Clara, quiet." She didn't argue. She'd learned already that when the mountain man's voice went flat like that, a body moved. She dropped the wash and went in through the door, and a moment later, Garrick came down off the roof soft as a cat, and came in after her and barred the door and took the long rifle down off its pegs and stood to the side of the shuttered window, looking out through the crack. "What is it?" Clara breathed. "Riders. 2 of 'em coming up the track." He watched. "Ain't Carver. Carver don't do his own errands." His jaw tightened. "It's Nathaniel Brooks, and a fella I don't know. Big fella, wearing his gun low and tied down." He glanced back at her grim. "That second one ain't a farmer, Clara. That's a paid man. You know what that means? It means the cheaper ways didn't work fast enough for Silas Carver," Clara said, and she was surprised how steady her voice came out. "It means he sent Nathaniel to sweet-talk me and a gun to stand behind him in case I don't sweet." "That's about the size of it." Garrick's hand was easy on the rifle. "Now listen to me. You stay behind this door. Whatever's said out there, whatever they offer or threaten you, don't come out, you don't answer. You let me do the talking. Can you do that?" And Clara Whitmore looked at the mountain man standing between her and the door, with his rifle in his hands, ready to face down 2 men. On her account, a woman he'd known 4 days, and she felt the old thing rise up in her, the thing that had let her dig 4 graves alone and cross 600 miles and stand in the dirt and tell a coward the truth of himself. "No," she said. "I can't do that." Garrick's head snapped around. "Clara, I'll not hide behind a door and let you take a bullet meant for me," she said, and she was already smoothing her skirt, already lifting her chin, already becoming the woman who'd faced Nathaniel down in the square. "It's my claim they want. My father's land. My fight. I've spent 3 years being a thing that happens to people, Mr. Hayes. Losing the farm, losing the family, losing the man I crossed a country to marry. Things happened to me, and I bore them. Well, I'm done bearing." Her eyes flashed. "This time I choose. And I choose to stand on my own porch and look Nathaniel Brooks in the eye and tell him, and whatever gun he's hired, that Clara Whitmore is not for sale. Not the claim and not the woman. And if they mean to take either, they'll have to do it in the daylight, where God and the whole valley can see them do it." For a long moment, Garrick Hayes stared at her. Then slowly, something that was almost pride and almost fear and almost something else altogether came up in his face, and he lowered the rifle a fraction, and he said low, "You are the most stubborn woman I ever met in my life." "I take that as a high compliment," Clara said. "You should." He shook his head. All right, we do it your way. But you stand behind me. Not because you can't stand for yourself, Lord knows you can, but because that man's gun changes the arithmetic, and I'll not have you in front of it. You do your talking over my shoulder. That's my one condition, and I'll bar this door and fight you on it if I have to." Clara looked at him. "That's fair," she said. "Over your shoulder. But my words." "Your words," Garrick agreed. And he lifted the bar, and he opened the door, and the 2 of them stepped out onto the rough porch of the mountain cabin to face the men Silas Carver had sent. Nathaniel Brooks had reined up 20 feet off, and he sat his horse with a smug half-smile that had been growing all the way up the mountain, a man who believed he held the winning hand. Beside him the big man sat easy and silent, and Clara looked at that one and felt the cold come back, because Garrick was right. He was a different animal entirely. A heavy, quiet man with pale eyes and a gun tied low, who watched Garrick the way one wolf watches another. "Well," Nathaniel called out, jovial as a Sunday host, "there she is, the mountain man and his charity case cozy as you please. I'd offer congratulations, Hayes, but I don't reckon it'll last." He grinned. "Miss Whitmore, you're a hard woman to run down. Mr. Carver sends his regards and an offer." Clara said nothing. She let the silence stretch the way she'd watched Garrick let it stretch in the square, and she felt Nathaniel's smile falter just slightly at the edges when she didn't fill it. $200, Nathaniel said, "for that old claim of your daddy's on the mussel shell. $200 cash money right now, and you sign the paper, and you're free to go anywhere you please with more money than a woman like you's ever seen at once." He reached into his coat and drew out a folded document and a fountain pen with a flourish holding them up. "It's a fair price for worthless bottom land nobody's worked in 20 years. More than fair. Mr. Carver's a generous man." Clara looked at the folded paper in Nathaniel's hand, and everything in her went sharp and cold and clear the way it did when she looked at a column of numbers and knew a lie was hiding in it somewhere. $200, she said quietly. 200, Nathaniel said. Cash. "For land that's about to have a railroad run straight through the middle of it," Clara said. "For a river bottom that Silas Carver spent 2 years, and Lord knows how much money buying up acre by acre, squeezing families off their farms to get. For the one section he can't get any other way, because my father filed and proved on it years before your Mr. Carver ever cast his greedy eye on this valley." She saw Nathaniel's smile die. $200. For land that's worth 10,000 if it's worth a nickel. She smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "You'll forgive me if I decline, Mr. Brooks." The silence that fell was total. Nathaniel's face had gone through 3 colors. "You," he started. How did I know?" Clara said. "Because I'm not the fool you took me for when you wrote me 11 letters to charm a claim out of a poor, lonely woman. I'm a bookkeeper, Mr. Brooks. The best there ever was. I read papers for a living once, and I read men besides, and I can read the both of you standing right there, plain as a ledger." Her voice rang out clear across the clearing. "You didn't come up this mountain to buy my father's land. You came to steal it cheap, from a woman you figured was too broke and too broken to know what she was holding. Well, you figured wrong. And you can carry that back down to Silas Carver, along with his fair offer, and you can tell him Clara Whitmore said the claim is not for sale, not at $200, and not at 10,000, and that she intends to file it fresh at the land office in Miles City the first chance she gets with witnesses, so there's no mistaking whose name is on it. And then let's see whose paper trumps whose." The big silent man shifted in his saddle. It was a small movement. His hand had drifted just an inch toward the gun tied low on his thigh. And Garrick Hayes, who had stood quiet as stone through all of it, letting Clara have her words, moved the rifle in his hands, not raising it, not pointing it, just turning it a quarter so the meaning was plain, and said in a voice as flat and cold as river ice, "I wouldn't." The big man looked at Garrick. Garrick looked back. And whatever passed between the two of them, wolf to wolf, in that long, stretched second, it ended with the big man's hand drifting slow and careful away from his gun, and coming to rest easy on his saddle horn, and the big man saying in a voice like gravel, the first and only words he spoke, the whole visit, "Another day, maybe." "Maybe," Garrick agreed, mild as milk. "But not this one. This one you turn that horse around and you take this lying dog with you and you ride back down my mountain and you tell Silas Carver that the lady's given her answer and that the next man comes up here uninvited with his gun tied down is going to find out real quick why I got a reputation for living alone." He never raised his voice. He never had to. "Go on now, while the going's easy." Nathaniel Brooks looked from Garrick's rifle to Clara's cold, clear eyes, to the big man who'd just backed down beside him and Clara watched the whole shape of his afternoon collapse in his face, watched him realize he'd ridden up expecting to bully a broken woman, and instead run headlong into a wall of two people who would not break. "You'll regret this," he spat, jamming the paper back in his coat. "Both of you. Carver owns this valley. He owns the law, he owns the bank, he owns the land office. You think you'll just walk into Miles City and file. He'll have men there before you're halfway. You've got nothing, Whitmore. A dead man's old claim and a hermit with a rifle. You've got nothing." "I've got the truth," Clara said. "And I've got the paper. And I've got a head for figures that'll tear Silas Carver's whole rotten scheme apart at the seams if it ever sees the inside of a courtroom." She took one step forward past Garrick's shoulder, now unafraid, and Nathaniel's horse shied back from the sheer force in her. "You go tell him that, Mr. Brooks. You tell Silas Carver that the woman you laughed at in the church square keeps books. You tell him she's seen how families lose their land in his bank. You tell him she'd dearly love the chance to look at every paper he's ever had a soul sign because she has never once in her life failed to find the lie hid in a column of numbers." Her voice dropped soft and deadly. "You tell him that, and then you watch his face. And you'll know, Mr. Brooks, at last exactly what it was he sent you up this mountain to steal. It wasn't 160 acres. It was the one witness in this whole territory who can prove what he is." Nathaniel Brooks had gone white as paper. He hadn't known. Clara saw it in his face, plain as print. Carver hadn't told his errand boy the whole of it. Nathaniel had thought he was fetching a worthless claim off a foolish woman. He hadn't understood until this moment, standing in a mountain clearing with a rifle looking at him, that the woman he'd humiliated for sport in front of 30 people was the single loose thread that could unravel Silas Carver's entire empire. And now he did understand. Clara watched it land. Watched him realize what he'd done, throwing her over in public, leaving her free and unwed, and holding both the claim and the knowledge, when he might have married her quiet and taken it all, and no one ever the wiser. "Oh God," Nathaniel said faintly. "Carver's going to, when he hears you know. He's going to want me gone worse than ever," Clara finished. "Yes, I imagine he is, which is why I don't intend to give him the chance." She stepped back level beside Garrick again, calm as still water. "Now do as Mr. Hayes said. Turn your horse around and go. And Nathaniel—" She waited till he looked at her. "You wrote me you were lonesome. 11 letters. You said a man ought not build a life alone." Her eyes were steady on his. "I believed you. That's the part I'll always carry. Not that you were cruel. Men are cruel. I learned that young. But that you looked at a lonely woman's heart, and you saw a thing to use. That's a special kind of low Mr. Brooks. And you'll answer for it. Maybe not to me, but you'll answer." Nathaniel had no reply. He hauled his horse around, and the big silent man turned with him, unhurried, giving Garrick one last long look over his shoulder that promised the thing wasn't finished. And the two of them rode back down the track and into the pines, and were gone. The sound of the hooves fading down the mountain, until there was nothing left but the wind in the high trees, and the roan blowing softly in the corral. Clara stood on the porch until the last of the sound had died. Then all at once, the strength went out of her legs. She didn't fall, but she swayed, and Garrick's hand was there at her elbow before she'd finished swaying steady and sure, and he held her up without making a fuss of it, and she got her feet back under her and let out a long, shaking breath that seemed to empty her clean to the bottom. "You can sit down now," Garrick said quietly. "They're gone. You did it. You can sit down." "I don't want to sit down." Clara laughed unsteady. "I'm afraid if I sit down I'll never get up again. My knees have gone to water. Isn't that a foolish thing? I stood there and stared down a hired gun without a tremor, and now that it's over, I can hardly stand." She pressed her hand to her chest. "How does a body do a brave thing and only get scared after?" "That's the only way anybody ever does a brave thing," Garrick said. "The scared comes after for everybody. The ones who tell you different are lying. Brave ain't not being scared, Clara. Brave is standing on your porch and saying your piece with your knees gone to water and nobody the wiser."
Oh, boss.
He steadied her another moment, then let go careful, making sure she had her feet. And you said your piece, Lord Woman. I've seen men with a lot more years and a lot more guns fold quicker than you just did. You tore that lying dog apart with nothing but the truth and a head for numbers. I ain't never seen the like. Clara looked up at him. And something had shifted between them in the space of that afternoon. Something that had been building slow over 4 careful days, and had just been forged hard and fast in the fire of standing side by side against 2 armed men. She could feel it. She suspected he could too. They had stopped being a mountain man and his charity case somewhere in the last 10 minutes and become 2 people who'd stood their ground together back to back and won. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "I've been thinking," he said at the same moment. And then they both stopped, and there was an awkward beat, and Clara felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. A flush come up in her cheeks that had nothing to do with fear. "You go first," she said. "I've been thinking you ought to call me Garrick," he said. "Seeing as we just faced down Silas Carver's guns together, and seeing as you've been cooking in my kitchen and fixing my ledgers and cleaning me out of house and home for 4 days. Mr. Hayes seems a mite formal is all." Clara smiled. It was a real smile, and it reached all the way up into her eyes, and it was the first fully real smile she'd smiled since long before the fever and the graves and the letters and the church square. "All right," she said. "Garrick." She tried it out and it fit her mouth easy. "And you'll call me Clara. Not ma'am, not Miss Whitmore. Clara." "Clara," Garrick said. And the way he said it, low and careful and like it was a thing worth saying right, made something turn over slow in Clara Whitmore's chest. A thing she'd thought was dead and buried 3 winters back with the rest of her family. A thing she had not expected to feel ever again in this life, and had made a hard peace with never feeling. But there it was. She looked away quick before he could see it in her face, and she busied herself with her fallen wash, gathering the fallen shirts from the ground where she'd dropped them when he'd told her to get inside. And Garrick, after a moment, went and gathered the ones on the far side, the both of them working in a silence that had gone from wary to something warmer, something easier without either one saying a word about it. They didn't speak of Carver again that afternoon. There'd be time enough for that, time enough to plan and to worry, and to reckon what a rich and ruthless man would do next now that he knew the woman with the claim also had the wits to hang him. That reckoning was coming, and they both knew it, and it sat on the edge of the day like a storm cloud on the edge of the sky. But not yet. For now there was wash to hang, and supper to cook, and a sagging roof still waiting on its hammer. And for now there were 2 people on a mountain who had, against everything the world had taught, the both of them found in each other the one thing neither had dared hope to find again. Clara hung the last shirt on the line and stood a moment looking down the whole long valley gold in the late light. The valley where a groom had laughed at her and a rich man plotted her ruin, and a whole town had watched her be shamed in silence. She was not afraid of it anymore. She had been afraid of the valley, and afraid of being nothing, and afraid of trusting, and afraid of hoping for 3 long unbroken years. And in the span of a single week on a rough mountain, with a quiet man who kept promises to the dead, the fear had loosened its grip, finger by finger, until now, standing in the gold light with her wash on the line, and her enemy's threat still hanging in the air, Clara Whitmore found that what she felt was not fear at all. It was something she'd near forgotten the name of. She heard Garrick's hammer start up again behind her patient, and steady mending the corner of the roof that had sagged so long, and she smiled to herself, and she rolled up her sleeves, and she went in to start the supper for the 2 of them, and the mountain held them both in its blue shadow as the sun went down over the valley of Red Hollow. The storm cloud broke 3 days later, and it did not come the way either of them had braced for. Clara was at the ledger when the rider came. She'd taken to keeping Garrick's books proper now, and more than his, because word had got around the mountain valley faster than either of them expected, that there was a woman up at the Hayes place who could read a column of figures and tell you where you'd been cheated, and folks had begun to climb the track with their own tangled papers in hand, a widow here, a broke-down old rancher there. Quiet, desperate people who'd lost land or were about to and didn't know how or why. Clara took them all. She sat them at Garrick's table and gave them coffee and spread their papers out and read them the way she read everything, slow and cold and sure, and one by one she found the same thing hidden in every one. Silas Carver's hand. It's the same trick every time. She'd told Garrick 2 nights back, tapping a widow's foreclosure notice. Every one of these folks went into Carver's bank to renew a note they'd carried for years, honest as the day, and every one of them signed a paper they thought was the same note they'd always signed. But it wasn't. Somewhere in the fine print in language a plain farmer can't parse the terms had changed. A shorter term, a balloon payment, a clause that lets the bank call the whole sum due on 30 days' notice for any reason or none. She'd shaken her head, her jaw tight with an anger that had been building all week. They didn't lose their land 'cause they couldn't pay Garrick. They lost it 'cause Carver wrote the papers so they'd fail and then called the note the day before harvest when nobody in the valley had cash money to save them. It's not banking. It's theft dressed up in banking's clothes. And it's the same theft over and over in every one of these. Garrick had looked at the papers spread across his table. "That's proof," he'd said slowly. "Ain't it? All laid together like that. That's proof of a scheme." "It's the start of proof," Clara had corrected. "It's a pattern, and a pattern's worth 10 times what one man's word is worth in a court. But it's not enough alone. Carver's got lawyers. He'll say every one of these folks signed freely, and technically they did. What I'd need," and her eyes had gone distant, the bookkeeper's mind working, "what I'd need is his side of it, the bank's own ledgers, because a scheme like this leaves 2 sets of tracks, Garrick. What the farmers signed, and what Carver wrote down for himself. And I'd bet my life that somewhere in Silas Carver's private books, there's a record he never meant a soul to see showing he knew exactly what he was doing and exactly what that land was worth. Men like him can't help it. They keep the true figures somewhere. They have to. It's the only way to know how much they've stolen." That conversation had sat between them for 2 days. And now there was a rider coming up the track, and Garrick was at the window with the rifle before the man had cleared the trees, and then he lowered it, frowning. "It's a boy," he said. "Just a boy, on a mule." The boy was maybe 14, thin and scared, and he'd ridden the mule half to death coming up the mountain. He wouldn't come inside. He stood in the yard, twisting his hat and looking back down the track like the devil might be on it, and he blurted out his message all in a rush. "Miss Whitmore. The widow Ames sent me. She said to tell you." He gulped air. "Mr. Carver's took the boarding house, called her note this morning. Give her till sundown to be off the property. And she said to tell you it's on account of you. She said Carver's telling folks in town that anybody helps you, anybody, so much as gives you the time of day, he'll call their paper too. He's squeezing the whole valley, miss, to get to you." The boy's voice cracked, and she said, he looked like he might cry. She said not to feel bad. She said she'd do it again. But she said you ought to know what it's costing folks you being up here, so you can decide with your eyes open. The yard went very quiet. Clara stood on the porch and felt the words go into her like cold water. Widow Ames, the broad, plain woman who'd fed her the first night and charged her nothing, and warned her about the Carvers over the washing up. Turned out of the home she'd kept for 30 years at sundown because she'd shown a stranger a kindness. "Where's she to go?" Clara asked, and her voice came out low. "Her sister's over in Cottonwood, but that's 40 miles, miss, and she's got no wagon Carver didn't take, and—" The boy stopped. "I'm sorry. I'm just to give the message. I got to get back 'fore anybody sees I come up here, or my ma loses our place, too." "You go," Garrick said, and his voice was gentle for the boy, but there was iron under it. "Ride careful, and you tell the widow." He glanced at Clara. "You tell her Garrick Hayes says she's got a wagon and a team waiting for her at the foot of this mountain by first light, no charge, no questions, and 2 strong backs to load it. You tell her that." The boy nodded and was gone, the mule scrambling back down the track, and then it was just the 2 of them again, and the storm cloud had finally broken, and it had broken over the head of a kind old woman who'd done nothing but be decent. Clara turned and went into the cabin and sat down hard at the table and put her face in her hands, and for a long moment she did not move. "Clara," Garrick said, "it's my fault." Her voice was muffled. "Everything you said would happen, it's happening, and it's landing on everybody but me, the widow. And it'll be the next one and the next. He can't get at me up here behind your rifle, so he's going to burn the whole valley to smoke me out. He'll take every farm, ruin every family until the whole of Red Hollow hates the sight of my name, and they come up here themselves with torches to hand me over just to make it stop." She lowered her hands, and her eyes were wet and furious both at once. "That's the scheme now, isn't it? That's what a man like Carver does. He doesn't fight me. He makes everybody else pay my debt until I've got no choice but to surrender to save them." Garrick was quiet a moment. "That's exactly what he does," he said. "You read him right. That's the game." "Then I have to give up the claim." Clara's voice was flat with despair. "I have to. I can't stand up here safe behind you while old women get thrown into the road and children lose their homes on my account. What kind of person would that make me? I'd be no better than the town that stood and watched me get shamed. I'd be worse. I'd be watching, and the cause." She stood up. "I'll go down. I'll sign the paper. $200 or nothing, I don't care. I'll give him the land, and I'll leave, and it'll stop." "No," Garrick said. "Garrick, no." He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and he did not touch her, but his voice held her still as any hand could have. "You listen to me. You give Silas Carver that claim, and you know what stops nothing. Nothing stops. The widow don't get her house back. Them families don't get their land back. All that happens is Carver wins, gets his railroad fortune, and learns for certain sure that squeezing the innocent is how you get what you want in this valley. He'll do it again the next time somebody stands in his way, and the time after that, 'cause you'll have taught him it works." He shook his head slowly. "You don't stop a thief by giving him the thing he's stealing. You stop him by taking away the thing that lets him steal. And you're the only person in this whole territory who can do that, Clara. You, with your head for figures and them papers on my table." Clara stared at him. "You want me to fight him, with the whole valley suffering for it. I want you to win," Garrick said. "Quick, before the whole valley suffers much more. There's a difference between giving up to save folks and fighting smart to save folks. And I'm telling you, the second one's the only one that actually saves anybody." He held her eyes. "You said it yourself 2 nights back. You said if you could get at Carver's own books, his private ledgers, you could prove the whole scheme. Well, what if you could? That's a fool's dream. Those books are in his bank in his safe behind his walls and his hired guns. I'd sooner get into the president's own strongbox." "Would they be in the bank?" Garrick asked. "Or would they be somewhere a careful man keeps the things he don't want even his own clerks to see?" And Clara went still, because that was a bookkeeper's question, and it was a good one. "His house," she said slowly. "A man like Carver keeping a second set of books. He never meant a soul to see. He wouldn't keep them at the bank where a clerk might stumble on them. He'd keep them close, at home, in a private study, in a locked drawer, or a personal safe." She frowned. "But that's no better. Worse. I can't just walk into Silas Carver's house." "No," Garrick agreed. "But you might get invited." "Invited by who? Carver wants me dead or gone." "He'd never—" "Not by Carver," Garrick said, and something in his voice made Clara look at him sharp. "By his daughter." The name hung in the air. Delphine Carver. The woman in butter-colored silk who'd laughed into her glove while Nathaniel Brooks shamed a bride in the dirt. "You've lost your mind," Clara said. "Delphine Carver hates me. She watched me get humiliated and she enjoyed it. Why in the world would she invite me into her father's house?" "Because," Garrick said slowly, and Clara could see he was working something out, even as he said it, something that had been turning in the back of his mind. "She don't hate you. I've been thinking on that day in the square, Clara. Been thinking on it a lot, And the more I turn it over, the more one thing sticks. When Nathaniel was laying into you cruelest he could manage, Delphine's the one who said, "Don't be cruel." You recall it. She said it. Nathaniel, don't be cruel. He watched Clara's face. A woman who purely enjoyed your shaming, don't say that. A woman who's trapped in the same house as Silas Carver and knows what he is, and's been made to smile through it her whole life. 'Cause she's got no more choice than a broke farmer with a bad note, that woman might say it. That woman might have been the only soul in that square besides me who felt the wrongness of it and hadn't the power to stop it. Clara opened her mouth to argue, and then closed it because a memory came back to her, sharp and sudden. Delphine Carver's face at the very end, when the crowd had turned on Nathaniel, when Clara had spoken her piece and the town had rounded on the coward. Delphine hadn't looked triumphant. She'd looked away. She'd found a sudden fascination with the tips of her own gloves. Clara had read it as cowardice at the time, but there'd been something else in it, something she hadn't had the space to notice. With her own world caving in, shame. Delphine Carver had looked ashamed. Even if you're right, Clara said carefully, even if she's not what she seemed, that's a long way from her helping me rob her own father. That's her family, her name, everything she has. It is, Garrick said. Which is why we don't ask her to. We don't ask her a thing. We just get you in that house. And if I've read her wrong, then you've had a bad supper with a cold woman and no harm done. But if I've read her right, he let it hang. Then maybe there's one more person in Red Hollow who's tired of watching Silas Carver take what ain't his. And maybe she's been waiting her whole life for somebody with the sand to stand up to him, and never dreamed it'd be a wagon bride in a mended dress. Clara stood a long moment, torn. How, she said finally, how do I get invited into that house? I can't just knock. And Garrick Hayes smiled slow and grim. You don't knock, he said. You send Silas Carver a message he can't ignore. You send word down the mountain that Clara Whitmore's ready to talk terms, that she's seen sense, that she'll come to his house alone, unarmed, to discuss selling the claim provided he calls off the squeeze on the valley folks while they parley. He met her eyes. He'll take that meeting. He'll take it in a heartbeat, 'cause he thinks he's finally squeezed you into folding, and a man like that can't resist watching somebody fold up close. He'll have you to his house, he'll sit you at his table, he'll pour you wine, and feel like a king. Garrick's smile hardened. And while he's busy feeling like a king, Clara, you'll be inside his walls with the sharpest pair of eyes in the territory, looking for where a careful man keeps the books he don't want seen. Clara felt her heart begin to pound. It's dangerous. He'd have me alone in his house. If he suspected anything, he won't be alone with you if I've got a say, Garrick said. But you're right that it's dangerous, and I'll not lie to you and say it ain't. So here's the truth of it, and then you decide, and whatever you decide, I'm with you. His voice dropped steady and sure. You can walk away from all this, right now. We can hitch the wagon and go help the widow to Cottonwood, and just keep on riding, the both of us. Put Red Hollow and Silas Carver 1,000 miles behind us, and never look back. I'll take you anywhere you want to go, and I'll ask nothing. That's a real choice, and it's an honorable one, and there's no shame in it. He paused. Or you can walk into that lion's den with nothing but your wits, and try to bring down the man who's ruining this whole valley, and maybe get yourself killed doing it. That's the other choice. And it's yours. It's always been yours. I'll not make it for you. Clara looked at him, and she thought of Widow Ames turned into the road at sundown. She thought of the boy on the half-dead mule, terrified his own mother would lose their farm. She thought of the widow's words passed up the mountain. She said she'd do it again. She thought of a whole valley of quiet, decent, ruined people, and a rich man in a fine house counting up his stolen acres. And she thought of the church square and 30 faces watching in silence while a woman was shamed in the dirt. And she thought of what one person could do if they were the one person who would actually do it. I'm not going to run, Clara said quietly. I ran once. I ran from Missouri clear to here, running toward a lie because I couldn't bear what my life had become. I'm done running. This valley showed me the only kindness I've had in 3 years, and I'll not leave it to that man." She lifted her chin. "I'll go to Silas Carver's house, and I'll find his books, and I'll bring him down Garrick if it's the last thing I do in this world." Garrick Hayes looked at her for a long moment with something in his eyes she didn't have a name for. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. "Together." The message went down the mountain the next morning, and Carver's reply came back before nightfall, oily with false courtesy, just as Garrick had predicted. Miss Whitmore was most welcome at the Carver residence. Mr. Carver was gratified she'd come to see reason. Supper Thursday evening, 7 o'clock. And of course, as a gesture of good faith, the pressure on the valley would ease while terms were discussed. Mr. Carver had never wished the good people of Red Hollow any harm. He was merely a businessman. And business once concluded need trouble? No one. "He's laying it on thick," Clara said, reading it. "He thinks he's won." "Let him think it," Garrick said. "A man who thinks he's won gets careless. That's what we want." They spent the next 2 days preparing the way. Soldiers prepare, going over every piece of it again and again. Garrick would take her down and wait near enough to come running far enough not to spook Carver. Clara would go in alone, would eat the man's supper and hear his terms, and seem to waver, would ask for a night to think it over, so as not to seem too eager, and all the while her eyes would be working, mapping the house, marking every door and drawer and locked room, finding where a careful thief kept his private sins written down. "And if you find the books," Garrick asked the night before, "then what?" "You can't just walk out with them. He'll notice." "I don't need to walk out with them," Clara said. "I need to read them. 10 minutes with those ledgers, and I'll have the whole scheme in my head, every figure, every date, every name. I don't forget numbers, Garrick. I never have. It's a curse most days, but not this once." She tapped her temple. "I get 10 minutes alone with Silas Carver's true books, and I can walk out of that house empty-handed and still hang him, because it'll all be up here, and then it's just a matter of getting it in front of a judge who isn't in his pocket." "That's the other trouble," Garrick said grimly. "The judge. Carver owns the local law. You said it yourself. Even with the proof, you take it to the Red Hollow magistrate and it goes straight in Carver's fire. Then we don't take it to the Red Hollow magistrate." Clara had thought on this too. "We take it to the federal land office in Miles City and pass them to the territorial court. Carver's scheme touches federal land grants and railroad right-of-way Garrick. That's not a matter for a county magistrate he's bought. That's a matter for the United States, and Silas Carver doesn't own the United States." Her eyes were hard. "He owns a valley. He thinks that's the whole world. It's the mistake every small king makes. There's always a bigger law than the one you've bought." Garrick looked at her with open admiration. "You've thought of everything," he said. "I've thought of everything I can," Clara corrected. "There's always the thing you didn't think of. That's the one that gets you." She met his eyes. "So, if it goes wrong in there, Garrick, if I find myself in a corner I didn't foresee, I need to know you'll come. Not think about it, not weigh it. Come." "Clara." He said it low, and he took her hand the first time he'd taken it since he'd pulled her up onto the roan in Red Hollow Street, and his grip was warm and rough and certain. "I made a promise once to a girl I couldn't get to in time. I've carried it 20 years. You think I'd stand at the bottom of that man's drive and weigh it while you were in trouble? I'll come. The second you need me, and probably before. You got my word, and my word's the only thing I've never once broke." And Clara believed him all the way down to the bone, in a way she had not believed a man about anything in 3 long years. Thursday came. Garrick brought her down the mountain in the last of the light, the both of them silent with the weight of the thing, and he stopped the wagon in a stand of cottonwoods a 1/4 mile from the Carver house, close enough to hear a shout, and he handed her down, and he looked at her a long moment in her one fine gray dress, mended, and pressed her hair pinned up neat. "You look like a woman going to a funeral," he said quietly. "Maybe I am," Clara said. "Silas Carver's if I'm lucky." But her hands were cold, and he saw it, and he took them both in his. "Hey," he said. "Look at me." She did. "You already did the hardest thing you'll ever do, and you did it in the church square in front of 30 people with your whole world caving in. Everything after that is downhill. You hear me? A supper with a rich man is nothing. You've stared down worse. You've stared down a hired gun on my own porch and never blinked." His thumbs moved over her cold knuckles. "Go in there and be exactly who you are. Clara Whitmore, the best set of eyes and the sharpest head for figures in the whole territory. That's all you got to be. That's more than enough." Clara looked up at him, and for one wild moment, standing in the cottonwood shadows, with her enemy's house glowing gold up the drive. She wanted to say a thing she had no business saying, a thing that had been growing in her all these days on the mountain, quiet and unlooked for and real. She saw it in his face that he was near to saying it too, whatever it was, that same unnamed thing sitting right there behind his tired, kind eyes. Neither one said it. There wasn't time, and there were things a body ought not say right before walking into a lion's den in case they turned into last words. So Clara only squeezed his hands once hard and stepped back and said, "Wait for me. I'll come out that front door on my own 2 feet if I have to walk over Silas Carver to do it." "I'll be right here," Garrick said. "The whole time. Right here." And Clara Whitmore turned and walked up the long drive to the big glowing house alone. The house was everything the mountain cabin wasn't, and it was meant to be. Silas Carver had built it to overawe, to make a body feel small the moment they stepped inside, and Clara felt the intent of it hit her like a wall, and she set her jaw against it and refused to feel small. She had dug 4 graves in frozen ground. She would not be cowed by a chandelier. Carver met her himself in the front hall, and Clara got her first close look at the man who'd ruined a valley. He was not what she'd pictured. She'd built a monster in her mind, and instead, here was a soft-looking, silver-haired gentleman with a kind, grandfatherly face and warm eyes, and a voice like poured honey, and Clara understood at once why he'd got away with so much for so long. He didn't look like a thief. He looked like somebody's beloved grandpa. That, she realized, was the most dangerous thing about him. "Miss Whitmore." He took her hand in both of his, warm and soft. "At last. I've so wanted to make things right between us. That business at the church, a dreadful affair, dreadful. Brooks is a coarse young man, and I've told him so. A woman ought never be treated that way. It shamed the whole town." He shook his head with what looked exactly like real sorrow. "I hope you'll let me make amends this evening. Come, come, supper's laid." And there it was. Clara thought, following him in. The very man behind the whole thing, tutting over her, shaming, as though he hadn't sent the hired gun up the mountain 3 days later. It should have made her furious. Instead, it made her cold and clear and careful, because now she knew exactly what she was dealing with. Not a hot-tempered brute, a smiling snake. And a smiling snake would give her more rope than an angry one ever would, because a smiling snake could not conceive that the mouse might be smarter than the cat. Delphine Carver was at the table already. She rose when Clara entered, and the 2 women looked at each other across the fine room, and Clara searched the younger woman's face for the thing Garrick had bet everything on. For a moment, she saw only the cool, polished daughter of a rich man, chin-high, expression closed. But then Delphine's eyes flicked just once to her father and away, and in that flick Clara saw it. A quickness, a wariness, the exact look of a person who has learned to watch the mood of a dangerous man in their own home and shape themselves to it moment by moment. The look of a bird that lives in a fine cage and has stopped beating its wings against the bars, but has never once stopped seeing them. Garrick had read her right. "Miss Whitmore," Delphine said, and her voice was perfectly correct and perfectly cool. "I'm glad you've come." "Are you?" Clara said. Not sharp, just quiet, just a small door left open. Something flickered behind Delphine's eyes. "Yes," she said, "I am." And they sat down to supper. It was an ordeal, that meal, and Clara bore it the way she'd borne everything, straight-backed and steady. Carver was charm itself, all warmth and reason, laying out his terms, as though he were doing her a great favor. He'd raised his offer, he said, to $1,000 out of respect for the hard time she'd had, and his own sense of what was decent. $1,000 was a fortune to a woman in her position. She could go anywhere, start fresh, put the whole unpleasant business behind her. And in exchange, he asked only for the old claim, a bit of worthless bottom land her poor father had filed on and never worked, of purely sentimental value, surely worth far more to Carver's grand plans for the valley's future than it could ever be to a woman alone. "I intend to bring prosperity to Red Hollow, Miss Whitmore," Carver said, warm as a hearth. "A railroad, jobs, growth. Everyone in this valley will be richer for what I'm building. But great works require assembling the land, you understand. One holdout, one stubborn parcel, and the whole enterprise founders, and the whole valley loses the future I mean to give them." He smiled his grandfather's smile. "Your father's claim is that one parcel. You hold the future of this entire community in your hands, my dear. I'm merely asking you to let me share it with everyone." It was, Clara had to admit, a masterful lie. If she hadn't spent a week reading the ruined papers of the very people this prosperity had destroyed, she might almost have believed him. She could see how a whole valley had. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Carver," she said, and let herself sound tempted, let herself sound like a tired, poor woman, being worn down. $1,000. I confess, it's more than I ever thought to have." She lowered her eyes. "It's a great deal to consider. Might I have the night to think on it? A decision this large, I wouldn't want to answer rash and regret it." Of course. Carver was expansive, magnanimous, a man who could afford to be certain he'd all but won. "Take all the time you need. Delphine, why don't you show Miss Whitmore to the sitting room while I have coffee brought? Give the ladies a chance to talk." And there it was, the opening, the moment Clara had come for. Delphine rose and led her from the dining room down a hall, and Clara's eyes were working every second of it, marking doors, marking a staircase, marking a heavy paneled door, standing slightly ajar off the main hall, with the corner of a big desk just visible within. Carver's study. It had to be. She fixed it in her mind, the exact spot, and walked on past it into the sitting room as though she'd seen nothing at all. The moment the sitting room door closed behind them, Delphine Carver's whole manner changed. She turned, and the cool polish fell away, and underneath it was a face taut with fear and something like desperation. And she crossed the room quick and close and spoke low and fast, her eyes darting to the door. "You have to leave," Delphine whispered. "Tonight, now, whatever he offered you, whatever you're thinking, don't. Take nothing from him, sign nothing, and get as far from Red Hollow as you can, and never come back." Her hands were shaking. "You don't know what he is. You think you do. You don't." Clara went very still. "Then tell me," she said quietly. "What is he?" And Delphine Carver's face crumpled just for a second, before she pulled it back together, and Clara saw the whole cost of a life lived in a fine cage written plain across it. "He's a murderer," Delphine whispered. The word dropped into the room like a stone into a well. "There was a family," Delphine said, the words coming faster now, spilling, as though a dam had broken after long years. "The Hendersons. 2 years ago, when he first started buying up the mussel shell. They wouldn't sell. Old Amos Henderson, he was stubborn. He'd worked that land 40 years, and he wouldn't take my father's money, and he wouldn't take his threats, and he started talking to the other families about what my father was doing to their notes, organizing them. He was going to write to the territorial governor." Delphine's voice shook. "And then one night the Henderson barn burned, with the whole family inside. Amos, his wife, their 2 grown sons. They said it was an accident, a lantern. My father paid for the funerals and wept at the graveside, and told the whole town what a tragedy it was." She looked at Clara with hollow eyes. "But I heard him, the night before. I heard him tell a man in his study that the Henderson problem would resolve itself by morning. I was 14. I've never told a living soul. I couldn't. Who would I tell? He owns the sheriff. He owns the magistrate. He owns everyone." Her voice broke. And now he's got you in his house, and you hold the last piece of land he needs. And I have watched this happen before, and I know how it ends, and I could not sit at that table one more minute and let it happen again without warning you. So please, please, leave, take nothing, just live." Clara stood absolutely still, and inside her, the whole shape of the thing had just changed, grown vast and dark, and far more dangerous than she'd known. Not a thief, a murderer. 4 people in a burning barn. "You were 14, Clara said softly. "And you've carried that alone for 2 years. I've carried it my whole life," Delphine said, and a tear spilled over. The knowing what he is, and smiling at his table, and wearing his silk, and being his lovely daughter while he... She pressed her hand to her mouth. "You want to know why I laughed in that church square? Why I stood there in that dress while Brooks shamed you? Because it's what I've done my whole life. Stand there, smile, look away. It's the only way to survive in his house. And I hated myself so much that day I could hardly breathe. Watching you, watching a woman with nothing stand up straighter than I ever have with everything." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "You shamed me more than Brooks shamed you, Miss Whitmore. Standing there with your chin up. Because I saw what a person could be, and I saw what I'd let myself become." And Clara Whitmore made a decision then, standing in the sitting room of a murderer's house, that she had not planned to make and could not have foreseen. She reached out and took Delphine Carver's shaking hands in both of hers, the way Garrick took hers when the fear came. "Delphine," she said quietly, "I'm not leaving. You have to. Listen to me. I'm not leaving, and I'm going to tell you why, and then you're going to have a choice to make the biggest one of your life, and I'll not blame you whichever way you fall." Clara's voice was low and steady and sure. "I didn't come here to sell your father a claim. I came here to end him. I'm a bookkeeper, Delphine, the best there is. And for a week now I've been reading the ruined papers of every family your father's cheated, and I've found the pattern, and I've got most of what I need to bring the whole thing crashing down in a federal court where your father's bought sheriff and bought magistrate can't touch it. Most of what I need. Not all." She held Delphine's eyes. "What I'm missing is his own hand. His private books. The true figures he keeps for himself, where a careful man writes down what he really did and what it was really worth. Because a scheme like his always keeps 2 sets of tracks, and if I could put my eyes on the second set, just for 10 minutes, I could hang Silas Carver so high the whole territory would see it. And you just told me he's not just a thief, he's a killer. Which means those books might hold more than land fraud. They might hold the Hendersons." Delphine had gone white. You want his study, his private ledgers." "I want to walk into that room down the hall," Clara said, "and read the truth for 10 minutes and walk out with it in my head, and then take it somewhere your father can't reach. And I think you know where he keeps those books, Delphine. I think you've known your whole life. And I think you've been waiting just as long for one single soul with the sand to actually use them." The sitting room was silent. Delphine Carver stood with her hands in Clara's, trembling. Her whole life balanced on a knife's edge, and Clara watched her wage the war that everyone who's ever lived under a tyrant has to wage sooner or later, the war between the safety of the cage and the terror of the open door. "He'll kill me," Delphine whispered. "If he ever knew I helped you. I'm his daughter, and he'd kill me the same as he killed the Hendersons. I have watched him do it. I know what he is." "Yes," Clara said. She would not lie to her. "He might. It's a terrible risk. It's the most dangerous thing you'll ever do." She tightened her grip. "But Delphine, hear me. You've been surviving in that cage your whole life, and I understand it. God knows I understand surviving. But there comes a day when just surviving costs more than it saves. When you've looked away so many times that you've started to disappear. You told me you saw what a person could be watching me in the square." Clara's voice went soft as a prayer. "Well, here's your church square, right now. This is the moment where you find out who you are. Not the daughter he made you. The person you actually are underneath the silk and the smiling. And nobody in the whole world can decide that for you but you. For a long, long moment, Delphine Carver did not move. And then slowly, she drew a breath that shook her whole body, and she straightened her spine the way Clara had straightened hers in the dirt of the church square. And something came into her face that hadn't been there before. Something that looked a great deal like a woman stepping out of a cage for the first time in her life. "The study," she said, and her voice, though it trembled, did not break. "There's a safe behind the portrait of my grandfather. He thinks I don't know the combination. He's wrong. I've watched him open it 100 times when he thought I wasn't looking. I've had the numbers in my head for 2 years and never once, not once, had the courage to use them." She looked at Clara, and there were tears on her face, but her jaw was set like iron. "You want 10 minutes with my father's true books, Miss Whitmore." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Then God help us both. I'll get you your 10 minutes. The plan they built in that sitting room took shape in under 5 minutes, whispered fast and low, with one ear on the hall, and it was a desperate, fragile thing, the kind of plan 2 frightened women make when there is no good plan to be had. Delphine would go first. She would find her father, tell him Miss Whitmore had taken faint after the rich supper and asked to lie down a spell in the sitting room before the coffee, and that she, Delphine, would sit with her. That would buy them a stretch of unwatched time. Then Delphine would slip back, and while Clara went to the study, Delphine would station herself in the hall where she could see her father's movements, and if he stirred toward the study, she would come singing down the hall, some little tune loud enough to carry a warning and a cover both. 10 minutes, Delphine whispered. "That's all I can promise you. Maybe less. He never leaves guests alone long. He gets suspicious. It's how he survived." 10 minutes is all I need," Clara said. "Go." And Delphine. She caught the younger woman's sleeve. "Thank you. Whatever happens after tonight, you're braver than you know." "I don't feel brave," Delphine whispered. "I feel like I'm going to be sick." "That's what brave feels like," Clara said. "I learned that this week. Go on." And Delphine went smoothing her face back into its practiced calm as she opened the door, and Clara heard her voice float down the hall light and easy, telling her father that poor Miss Whitmore was overcome and resting, and Silas Carver's honeyed reply, all solicitude, and Clara stood alone in the sitting room, with her heart slamming against her ribs, and counted to 60, the way they'd agreed. Then she opened the door and stepped into the hall. It was the longest walk of her life, those 30 feet to the study door. Every board seemed to shout under her shoes. She kept waiting for a hand on her shoulder, for Carver's honeyed voice behind her, for the whole thing to come apart before it began. But the hall stayed empty, and Delphine's light chatter drifted from the far parlor, keeping the old man occupied, and Clara reached the paneled door standing ajar, and slipped through it into Silas Carver's private study, and eased it near shut behind her. The room was a rich man's room, all leather and dark wood, and dominated by a great oil portrait of a stern old man in an old-fashioned collar. The grandfather. Clara crossed to it fast and got her fingers behind the heavy frame and swung it out on its hidden hinge, and there it was, set into the wall behind a squat iron safe with a brass dial. Her hands were shaking. She made them stop. A bookkeeper's hands did not shake over numbers. That was the one thing in this world she knew how to be steady about, and she reached for that steadiness now, like a drowning woman reaching for a rope. She turned the dial to the numbers Delphine had breathed to her in the sitting room. Right, left, right, her ear against the cold iron. And on the last number, something inside gave a small, heavy click, and the handle turned under her hand, and the safe swung open. Inside was money-banded stacks of it, a pistol, a leather pouch of gold coin, and beneath all of it at the bottom, 2 thick ledgers bound in plain black, the kind of books a man buys cheap and keeps hidden, because what's written in them is worth killing for. Clara took them out with hands that had gone cold and sure, and she carried them to the desk, and she opened the first one under the lamp, and she began to read. And the world she read there was worse than anything she'd imagined. It was all there. Everything. Silas Carver had kept his true books the way she'd known he would, Because a man who steals must count his stealings, or he cannot know his own worth, and here was the counting page after page in a cramped, careful hand. Here was every family in the valley listed by name, with 2 columns beside each what the land was worth, and what Carver had paid to take it, and the gap between them was a canyon. Here were the doctored notes cross-referenced to the honest ones, with Carver's own notations on which clauses had been altered and when. Here were payments to the sheriff month by month, and to the magistrate, and to a land office clerk in Miles City, named in full. Here was the whole rotten architecture of it laid out by the architect himself, a confession in his own hand that no lawyer on earth could argue away. And here near the middle of the second book, dated 2 years back, was an entry that stopped Clara's heart cold. Henderson matter resolved. Paid J. Coyle $200 services. Land now clear. J. Coyle. A name, a sum, a date 3 days before the Henderson barn burned with a whole family inside it. Not proof of murder that would stand alone, but a thread. A thread with a name on the end of it. A hired man called Coyle, who'd been paid $200 for services the very week 4 people died, and Clara knew reading it that this single line was the loose end that could unravel not just a land fraud, but a killing if the right federal man pulled on it hard enough. She had it. All of it. She closed her eyes for 1 second and let the figures burn themselves into her memory, the way figures always did, indelible, unforgettable, the curse that had become her one great weapon. Names, sums, dates. The whole scheme top to bottom filed away in the one place Silas Carver could never reach it behind her own eyes. And that was when she heard it. Delphine's voice rising suddenly from the far parlor, breaking into song. Loud and bright and just slightly wrong. A hymn started too fast and too high, and under it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a heavy tread coming down the hall. Silas Carver was coming. Clara's blood turned to ice. She had maybe seconds. She snapped the ledger shut and spun to the safe, and her hands so steady over the numbers betrayed her. Now fumbling the heavy books back into the bottom, dragging the money and the pouch back over them, and she swung the iron door and spun the dial and got her fingers behind the portrait and heaved it back into place, and it settled against the wall with a soft thud just as the study door swung open and Silas Carver stood in it. Clara was in the middle of the room. There was no hiding what she was. She was a guest alone in a private study she had no earthly business being in, and the smiling grandfather's face in the doorway was not smiling now. "Miss Whitmore," Silas Carver said softly, "you're a long way from the sitting room." Clara's mind raced, and 3 years of learning to think fast while her heart broke came to her aid. "Oh, Mr. Carver, thank goodness." She let her voice go faint, unsteady, a woman still recovering from a spell. She pressed the back of her hand to her brow. "I felt so poorly, and your daughter stepped out a moment, and I got so turned around, looking for a breath of air. I opened this door thinking it might be the way out to a porch. I do beg your pardon. Your home is so grand I'm quite lost in it." She swayed a little convincingly. "Is there somewhere I might sit? I'm not myself at all." For a long, terrible moment, Silas Carver looked at her. And Clara saw his eyes move past her to the portrait of his grandfather, just a flick, checking. And she prayed to every god she'd ever half believed in that she'd hung it straight, that no corner sat proud of the wall, that a lifetime of steady hands hadn't finally failed her in the one instant it mattered most. Carver's eyes came back to her. "Of course," he said, and the honey was back in his voice, but something cold moved beneath it now, some new watchfulness. "You must forgive me. I'm protective of my study. A businessman keeps sensitive papers, old habits." He stepped aside and gestured to the hall, courtly as ever. "Let me see you back to the sitting room. Delphine." He raised his voice slightly, and there was an edge in it now. "We'll wonder where we've got to." Clara walked past him on legs that had gone to water for the second time in a week, and she felt his eyes on her back the whole way, and she knew with cold certainty that Silas Carver was not a man who believed in coincidences, and that whether or not he'd caught her, he did not trust her now, and the fragile safety of the evening had cracked straight down the middle. Delphine met them in the hall, And Clara saw the girl's face go tight with terror behind her practiced smile when she saw her father's expression, and Clara gave her the smallest shake of the head. "Don't hold. We're not caught yet." And Delphine held. "There you are, Miss Whitmore," Delphine said brightly. "I turned my back a moment, and you'd wandered off. You did give me a fright." "I'm so sorry," Clara said. "I'm still not right in my head. I think, Mr. Carver, if you'll forgive me, I ought to go home and rest and give you your answer in the morning as we agreed. I'm poor company tonight, and I want to consider your generous offer with a clear head." "I quite understand," Carver said. But his eyes had gone flat and assessing, and Clara understood that a decision was being made behind them, and that it was not going her way. "Though I confess, Miss Whitmore, I find myself hoping we might settle things tonight after all. I dislike loose ends. They have a way of—" He smiled, and it did not reach his eyes at all now, resolving themselves badly when left too long. The Henderson matter resolved. Clara's stomach turned over. The very words from his ledger, the very phrasing dropped now into the air between them like a threat wrapped in silk. He was telling her. In his own coded way, the way a snake shows its fangs without striking, he was telling her exactly what happened to loose ends in Silas Carver's valley. "I'll have your answer at first light," Clara said steadily. "You have my word, and I always keep my word, Mr. Carver. It's the one thing I have left." She started for the front door. She was 10 feet from it, 10 feet from the night and the cottonwoods and Garrick waiting in the dark, when Silas Carver said, mild as anything, "Coil." And a door opened off the hall, and the big silent man from the mountain stepped out of it, the hired gun with the pale eyes and the low-tied pistol. And Clara understood in one sick lurch that the man who'd been paid $200 for the Henderson services, the man whose name she'd just read 3 minutes ago in a hidden ledger, had been in the house the whole time, and that his name was Coil, and that Silas Carver had just called him into the hall. "Miss Whitmore's not feeling well," Carver said pleasantly. "See that she doesn't leave in such a state. It wouldn't be safe, a woman alone on the road at night in her condition. We'll make her comfortable here until she's herself again." He turned his grandfather's smile on Clara, and it was the most frightening thing she had ever seen. "I insist. You're my guest. I'd never forgive myself if something happened to you out there in the dark." Coil moved to stand between Clara and the door, and Clara Whitmore, who had dug 4 graves in frozen ground and crossed 600 miles, and stared down this same man on a mountain. Porch felt real terror close over her, at last, cold and total, because she was in a murderer's house with a murderer's hired killer between her and the only way out. And the smiling old man had just in the politest possible words told her she was never leaving. But she did not let it show. That was the last weapon she had, and she gripped it hard. She would not let Silas Carver see her afraid. "That's very kind," she said, and her voice, God be thanked, came out steady. "But I really must insist on going home. People know I'm here, Mr. Carver. Garrick Hayes brought me down and he's waiting for me. If I don't come out, he'll come in. And I don't think you want Garrick Hayes coming into your house looking for me. I've seen what he's like when he's roused. I don't think all the hired men in the valley would be enough." Something flickered across Carver's face. It was the first crack she'd put in him all night, and she pressed it. "He's a quarter mile off in the cottonwoods," Clara said, "watching this house. He told me if I wasn't out that front door on my own 2 feet within the hour, he'd assume the worst and come for me, and he'd bring that rifle, and he doesn't miss. So you have a choice to make, Mr. Carver, and you'd best make it quick. You can let me walk out that door right now tonight on my own feet and have my answer in the morning like a gentleman. Or you can keep me here and find out just how badly a mountain man handles being lied to about a woman she caught herself, changed it, a woman under his protection. And I promise you, whatever's in your ledgers about resolving loose ends, none of it accounts for Garrick Hayes." The hall was dead silent. Silas Carver studied her, and Clara watched the calculation run behind his kindly eyes, the same cold arithmetic he ran on everything, weighing the risk of Garrick Hayes against the risk of letting her walk out with whatever she might or might not have seen. And Clara knew the numbers were close, too close that she'd bought herself a chance but not a certainty, and that it all came down now to whether Silas Carver believed her bluff about the rifle in the dark. "Coyle," Carver said at last. The big man looked at him. "Escort Miss Whitmore to the front door." A pause. "See that she reaches her friend safely. We wouldn't want any misunderstanding." He turned to Clara, and the smile was back warm and grandfatherly and utterly without mercy. "First Light Miss Whitmore, I'll expect your answer. And do give my regards to Mr. Hayes." His voice dropped soft as a blessing and cold as a grave. "Tell him I said the mountain air can be treacherous this time of year. Rock slides, accidents. A man ought to be careful where he steps." Clara said nothing. She walked to the door, coil a wall of silence at her shoulder, and she opened it herself, and she stepped out into the blessed cold night air. And Coyle stood in the doorway watching her go down the long drive with his pale, flat eyes, and she did not run. Though everything in her screamed to run, because she would not give them the satisfaction. And she walked the whole long drive at a steady pace, with her chin up and her heart hammering. And only when she reached the cottonwoods and the dark closed over her did her legs finally give out. Garrick caught her before she hit the ground. "I've got you," he said low and fierce, his arms around her, holding her up. "I've got you. You're out. You're safe. I've got you." She was shaking all over now, the terror pouring out of her in great silent shudders, and he held her through it solid as the mountain, and he did not ask her a single question until the worst of it had passed. "I was 2 minutes from coming through that door," he said into her hair. "When you didn't come at the hour, I near lost my mind. I had the rifle up, and I was coming. What happened in there?" Clara pulled back enough to look at him, and even in the dark, he could see her face had changed, that she'd gone into that house one thing and come out another. "I got it," she whispered. "Garrick, I got all of it. The books, his own hand, every family, every doctored note, every payment to the sheriff and the magistrate. It's all in my head, every figure. I can hang him." She gripped his coat. "But it's worse than we knew. So much worse. He's not just a thief. Delphine told me, and then I read it in his own book. Garrick, he had a family killed. The Hendersons, 2 years ago. Burned in their own barn because old Amos wouldn't sell and started talking. 4 people. And there's a name in the ledger. A hired man he paid $200 for the services 3 days before the fire, and that same man," her voice broke, "that same man walked me to the door just now. Coyle. He's been in the house the whole time. Silas Carver keeps a murderer on his staff, and he called him into the hall to threaten me, and the only thing that got me out that door was telling him you'd come through the wall with that rifle if I didn't." Garrick had gone very still. "He threatened you," he said. "Flat. Deadly. He threatened us both." Clara wiped her face. "He told me to give you his regards. He said tell you the mountain air's treacherous this time of year. Rock slides, accidents, that a man ought to be careful where he steps." She looked up at him. "He knows I saw something, Garrick, or he suspects it strong enough. He's not going to wait for morning. A man who burns families in barns doesn't wait. We have to move tonight, now. We have to get what I know in front of somebody Silas Carver can't reach, or we're both dead by sunup, and so is any chance those valley folks ever get their land back." Garrick was already moving her toward the wagon. "Miles City," he said. "The federal land office and the territorial marshal both. It's a hard 2 days ride, harder in the dark, but there's a night train out of the Dawson Junction. If we can make the junction by dawn, we can be in Miles City by tomorrow evening, and have you in front of a federal man before Carver even knows we've left the county." He handed her up onto the seat fast. "But Clara, the second Carver figures we've run for Miles City, instead of caving in the morning, he'll know. He'll send Coyle and whoever else he's got after us on the fastest horses in the valley, and they'll aim to catch us on the road before we ever reach the law. This ain't over. It's just started. You understand me. The most dangerous part of this whole thing is the next 12 hours. "Then let's not waste them," Clara said, and there was iron in her voice now, iron forged in a murderer's study. "Drive, Garrick, drive." He drove. The wagon lurched out of the cottonwoods and onto the road, the team laying into the traces, and Garrick pushed them hard through the dark. and Clara sat beside him, with the whole damning arithmetic of Silas Carver's crimes burning behind her eyes, and her ears straining backward for the sound of hooves on the road behind. For a mile then, too, there was nothing but the wind and the wheels and the labored breath of the horses. And then, far back, but closing the sound they'd both been dreading. Riders, more than one, coming fast. "They're on us," Garrick said grimly, not turning. "Faster'n I hoped. Carver didn't even wait to be sure. He just sent 'em." He glanced at her. "This wagon can't outrun saddle horses, Clara. Not loaded, not on this road. We got maybe 2 miles before they're on top of us." Clara's heart was pounding, but her mind, the cold, clear bookkeeper's mind that had never once failed her, was already working the problem the way it worked, a crooked ledger looking for the angle, the hidden figure, the thing the other man hadn't accounted for. "The Dawson Junction," she said. "How far?" 6 miles yet. We'll never make it ahead of them." "We don't have to make it ahead of them," Clara said suddenly. "We have to make it ahead of them, knowing what I know. Garrick, it's all in my head, the whole case. It doesn't matter if they catch the wagon, it matters if they catch me." She turned to him, and a desperate plan was taking shape. "The river. You said the road runs along the river to the junction. There's a place, isn't there, where the road forks where a body on foot could go down to the water, and along the bank where a horse can't follow in the dark." "The gorge," Garrick said slowly. "Yeah, mile ahead. Road forks at the old ford. Horses have to take the high road round. A person on foot could scramble down through the gorge and come out near the junction. It'd cut 2 miles, but it's rough ground in the dark, Clara. Break your neck rough. Then here's what we do," Clara said fast, the plan coming whole now. "At the fork, you keep the wagon on the high road. Loud, let them chase it. Let them chase you. And I go down through the gorge on foot in the dark with everything I know, and I make the junction, and I get on that train, and I get to Miles City, and Silas Carver can catch an empty wagon and a mountain man who'll tell him nothing." She gripped his arm. "It's me they need to stop, not the wagon. If we split, they can't stop us both, and they'll follow the wagon because that's where they'll think I am." "No." Garrick's answer was instant and hard. "No. I'm not sending you alone down a gorge in the dark with Coyle behind us. Absolutely not." "Garrick." "I said no, Clara." His jaw was set. "There's got to be another way that don't split us up. I gave you my word I'd come the second you needed me, and I can't come if there's 2 miles of rock between us." "You already came," Clara said, and her voice was fierce and gentle at once. "You came in the church square when nobody else would. You came up your own mountain to give me a floor. You came to your porch to stand beside me against his guns. You've come every single time, Garrick Hayes, and now I need you to do the hardest thing, which is to let me carry this last part alone because it's the only way it works." The rider's hooves were louder now, gaining. "You said brave is doing the thing with your knees gone to water. Well, I'm terrified. My knees are water, and I'm going down that gorge anyway because I'm the only one who can, and you're going to draw them off and keep yourself alive because if this goes wrong, I need there to be one person left in this world who knows the truth and can tell it. Please, trust me the way I trusted you when I climbed up behind you on that horse in Red Hollow." The fork was coming up. Garrick had seconds to decide, and Clara watched him wage the same war Delphine had waged, the war between the need to protect and the need to trust. And she watched him understand the way she'd needed him to. That sometimes the bravest and most loving thing a person can do is let the one they care for walk into the dark on their own 2 feet. "Damn it," Garrick said, low and anguished. "Damn it, Clara." "Is that a yes?" The fork was on them. He hauled the team and the wagon slewed onto the high road, and in the same motion, he grabbed her one hand behind her head and kissed her hard and quick and desperate. The thing neither of them had said, finally said in the only language there was time for, and then he broke it off, and his eyes were burning into hers. "You make that train," he said. "You get to Miles City. You bring that man down. And then you come find me, Clara Whitmore, because I've got a great deal more to say to you, and I'll not have it end here on a dark road with it half said." He shoved a small pistol into her hands, closed her fingers around it. "Take this. You point it, and you pull. That's all, no aiming needed close up. Now go. Down the bank there where it drops. Go." Clara went. She flung herself off the moving wagon into the dark, and rolled and came up scrambling, and behind her, she heard Garrick shout to the team, and crack the reins, and drive the empty wagon roaring up the high road loud as thunder, drawing every eye and ear behind it, and she heard the riders take the fork after him, without slowing, 4 of them at least, by the sound thundering up the high road after the mountain man and his decoy, and not one of them turned down toward the gorge, where a woman in a gray dress was already climbing down through the dark toward the river, with a whole man's ruin locked behind her eyes. The gorge was every bit as bad as Garrick had promised. Clara went down it in the black dark, half climbing and half falling, the pistol jammed in her waistband, and her hands torn raw on the rocks, her fine gray dress ripping on branches, her ankles turning on loose stone. Twice she fell hard, and lay stunned, and made herself get up. She could hear the river below her, and she went toward it, and she followed it the way Garrick had said, along the bank, where the going was treacherous, and no horse could come, and every step she took, she counted. The way she counted everything, and every figure of Silas Carver's crimes, she recited to herself in rhythm with her steps to keep them fresh and keep herself moving. Somewhere far up on the high road, faint now, she heard it. A shot, then 2 more. She froze on the riverbank, her heart in her throat. Garrick. That was Garrick back there. 4 armed men against him, and an empty wagon, and she had left him to it. She had let him send her into the dark while he drew the killers off, and now there were shots, and she could not go back, could not do one single thing but keep moving toward the junction and pray. And she had never in her life hated a choice the way she hated that one. Standing on a dark riverbank listening to gunfire, she could not answer. "You keep your word, Garrick Hayes," she whispered into the dark, tears streaming down her torn face. "You told me you had more to say, so you keep your word and you stay alive to say it. Don't you dare. Don't you dare leave me the last one standing again." And she turned, and she ran on toward the junction and the train, and Miles City, carrying the truth through the dark, because it was the only thing left she could do. And because a whole valley of ruined people, and a brave girl in a fine cage, and a mountain man making his stand on a lonely road, were all depending on a bookkeeper's memory reaching the law before Silas Carver's riders reached her. The junction lights showed through the trees just as the eastern sky began to gray. Clara stumbled out of the gorge and onto the platform of the Dawson Junction more dead than alive. Her dress in rags, her hands bloody, her hair torn from its pins, and the station agent took one look at her and came around his counter fast, and Clara held up a hand to stop his questions. "The Miles City train?" she gasped. "When?" "20 minutes, ma'am." "But Lord, are you?" "I need a ticket. I've got money." She dug at the hem of her ruined dress, tore it, spilled the $11 she'd carried 600 miles and never spent. "And I need you to listen to me and remember what I say, because I might be the only one who reaches Miles City, and somebody besides me needs to know it." She grabbed the agent's sleeve, and her voice, though it shook, was clear as a bell. "My name is Clara Whitmore. If a man named Silas Carver or a man named Coyle or anybody comes asking after a woman in a gray dress, you never saw me. But if a mountain man named Garrick Hayes comes—" Her voice broke, and she forced it steady. Tall, dark rides, a roan, quiet-spoken. "You tell him Clara made the train. You tell him she's gone to Miles City to finish it. You tell him she said to keep his word. Can you do that? Can you remember?" "Ah, yes, ma'am. Garrick Hayes. Clara made the train, gone to finish it, keep his word." The bewildered agent nodded. "I'll remember. But ma'am, you're hurt, "I'll live," Clara said. "I've got too much to do to die." And she took her ticket in her bloody hand, and she sat down on the platform bench to wait for the train that would carry Silas Carver's ruin to the one court in the territory he did not own. And she turned her face to the graying east, and she prayed with everything left in her that somewhere back on a dark mountain road, a man who kept his word was still alive to keep the rest of it. The train came out of the dawn with its lamp burning and its whistle crying, and Clara Whitmore rose from the bench on torn and shaking legs, and she climbed aboard, and she took the whole truth of Silas Carver with her into the east, and behind her, The sun came up red over the mountains of a valley that did not yet know its long night was finally at terrible cost about to end. The train reached Miles City in the long gold light of evening, and Clara Whitmore stepped down onto the platform, still in her ruined dress, her hands wrapped in strips torn from her own petticoat. And she did not stop to rest, and she did not stop to weep, and she did not stop to wonder whether Garrick Hayes was alive or dead behind her, because she had learned on a dark riverbank that the only way to carry an unbearable thing was to keep walking under it. She asked the first uniformed man she saw where the federal land office was, and when he told her it was closed till morning, she asked where the territorial marshal kept his office, and when he pointed, she walked there on legs that should not have carried her another step, and she pounded on the door until a lamp came on inside. The man who opened it was broad and gray-mustached, and none too pleased to be roused. A deputy marshal named Hollis, with his suspenders down and his supper on his breath, and he took one look at the wild, bloody woman on his step and started to shut the door. Clara put her ruined hand against it. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said, "and I have come 2 days and a night to lay before the federal government a scheme of land fraud, bribery of county officials, and the murder of 4 people committed by a man named Silas Carver in the valley of Red Hollow. And if you close that door on me, Deputy, you'll be closing it on the biggest case that ever crossed your desk, and I'll see to it the territorial governor hears you did." She held his eyes. "Now, may I come in and sit down? I've had a hard trip." Hollis looked at her a long moment. He was not a stupid man, and there was something in the ruined woman's steady eyes that told him she was neither drunk, nor mad, nor lying, and he had been a lawman long enough to know the difference between a crank and a witness who has walked through fire to reach him. He opened the door. "Sit down, ma'am," he said. "I'll put the coffee on, and you'll start at the beginning, and you'll leave nothing out." Clara sat down in the deputy marshal's office, and she began at the beginning, and she left nothing out. She talked the whole night through. She told him about the church square and the claim and the letters, though those were only the shape of the thing. And then she gave him the substance, and the substance was numbers. The numbers she'd read in a hidden ledger by lamplight and burned into her memory. And she gave them to him in order, name by name, family by family. Every doctored note, and every stolen acre, and every payment to the sheriff of Red Hollow and the magistrate of Red Hollow and a land office clerk right there in Miles City, whom Deputy Hollis knew by name and had never trusted. Hollis stopped writing at one point and just stared at her. "You're giving me a man's private books," he said slowly, "out of your own head, word for word." "I don't forget numbers," Clara said. "It's the one thing I've got. Write them down, Deputy. Everyone. Because I can swear to them under oath, and I can point you to where the true ledgers sit behind a portrait of Silas Carver's grandfather, and a federal warrant will find them exactly where I say they are, and then it won't be my word anymore. It'll be his own hand hanging him." And then she gave him the last thing, the worst thing, the line she'd read near the middle of the second book that had stopped her heart. "There's an entry," she said quietly, "dated 2 years back. Henderson matter resolved. Paid J. Coyle $200 services. Land now clear. 3 days before the Henderson family burned to death in their barn. 4 people deputy. Amos Henderson, his wife, and his 2 grown sons. The whole valley was told it was an accident. A lantern." Her voice did not shake, though it cost her everything to keep it steady. It was not an accident. Silas Carver paid a man named Coyle to make a family that wouldn't sell into a family that couldn't refuse. And that same man Coyle is at this moment somewhere on the road between here and Red Hollow, hunting the one witness who can prove it and the man who drew him off so I could reach you. And here at last after a whole night of iron. Clara's voice finally broke. "The man who drew them off may already be dead for it. So I would be obliged, Deputy Hollis, if you would stop writing for one moment and tell me how fast you can put federal men on the road to Red Hollow. Because there is a good man back there, the only truly good man I have met in 3 hard years, and he is worth more than every acre in that valley, and I left him alone on a dark road with 4 killers, and I have been carrying that since before dawn." Deputy Hollis set down his pen. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had changed entirely over the course of that long night, gone from suspicion to something near reverence. In 19 years wearing this badge, I have never once heard testimony like what you've given me tonight, and I have never wanted to catch a man the way I want to catch this one. There's a federal judge sleeps 3 doors down. I'm going to wake him. We'll have warrants by sunup and a posse of United States Marshals on the road to Red Hollow within the hour, and I will personally ride at the head of it." He stood reaching for his hat and his gun belt. "And we'll pray we're not too late for your mountain man. But ma'am," he paused at the door, "whatever's happened back there, you understand you've already won. Dead or alive, the men who chased you chased the wrong quarry. You got through. The truth got through. Silas Carver lost the moment you stepped on that train, and he doesn't even know it yet." But Clara could not feel that she'd won, not with the not knowing sitting on her chest like a stone. She rode with the marshals herself over Hollis's objection, wrapped in a borrowed coat on a borrowed horse, because she could not have borne to wait in Miles City for word, and the long ride back to Red Hollow was the worst of her life, worse than the gorge, worse than the church square, every mile of it filled with the sound of those 3 shots on the dark road, and the terrible arithmetic of 4 guns against 1 good man. They reached Red Hollow at midday of the following day. 12 federal marshals with warrants, and Clara Whitmore riding among them, and the town that had watched her be shamed in silence now watched her ride in at the head of the law, and the difference was not lost on a single soul who saw it. They took Silas Carver at his own dinner table. He tried the charm first, the honeyed grandfatherly voice, the talk of a terrible misunderstanding of a hysterical woman with a grudge, and Deputy Hollis let him talk himself out, and then laid the federal warrant on the table beside his plate and said, "We'll be having a look behind your grandfather's portrait now, Mr. Carver." And Clara watched the color drain from that kindly face, as he understood all at once that the mouse had been smarter than the cat all along. The ledgers were exactly where Clara had said they'd be, and it was, as she'd promised, no longer her word against his. It was his own hand. Every figure she'd recited from memory matched the books, line for line. And when Deputy Hollis compared them page by page to the numbers Clara had given him 2 nights before in his office, he took off his hat and just looked at her, because there is no forgery of memory that matches a hidden book down to the last stolen dollar. And everyone in that room understood they were looking at a witness the like of which the territory had never seen. Silas Carver was taken away in irons that afternoon, and the smiling grandfather did not smile as they led him out, and the whole valley of Red Hollow came out into the street to watch it happen. The widows and the ruined ranchers and the families driven off their land, and they did not cheer because it was too solemn a thing for cheering. They just watched in a silence utterly unlike the silence of the church square. A silence that was full instead of empty. The silence of people watching a long nightmare finally break. But Clara barely saw it, because she was already off her borrowed horse and pushing through the crowd, asking, grabbing arms, and asking the only question that mattered to her in all the world. "Garrick Hayes, the mountain man, has anyone seen?" Garrick Hayes, and getting only shaken heads and blank frightened faces, until at last a familiar voice cut through the crowd, cracked with age and thick with tears. "Clara, Clara, child, Widow Ames." She hadn't gone to Cottonwood after all. She'd stayed unable to leave, and now she seized Clara by both arms, and her broad plain face was streaming. "The widow is he?" Clara could not finish. "Garrick, do you know? He's alive." Widow Ames sobbed. "He's alive, child. Barely, but alive. They brought him down off the high road yesterday morning, shot through, more dead than living, and Doc Pearson's had him 2 days now, and wouldn't promise anything, but this morning, the fever broke Clara, and Doc says he'll keep. He says the man's too stubborn to die." She was laughing and crying at once. 4 of them, they say. 4 men against him on that road, and he took a bullet in the shoulder, and one that near clipped his heart, and he still put 2 of them down, and drove the other 2 off, and crawled a mile to where a rancher found him. 4 men, Clara, and that fool mountain man wouldn't die. And you want to know what he said first thing when the fever broke and he could talk. He didn't ask if he was going to live. He grabbed Doc Pearson's collar and he asked, "Did Clara make the train?" That was the first thing out of his mouth. Did Clara make the train? And Clara Whitmore, who had held herself together through a murderer's study and a black gorge, and a night of testimony, and a 2-day ride of not knowing, who had not let herself fall apart once through the whole long ordeal, because there had been no one to catch her, finally came apart entirely right there in the street, in the arms of a widow who'd lost her home for showing a stranger a kindness. "Take me to him," she wept. "Please, take me to him right now." He was in the back room of Doc Pearson's house, gray-faced and bandaged, and terribly still against the white pillows. But his chest rose and fell, and when the door opened, his eyes came open too slow and found her, and Clara saw the tired kindness in them come alive all at once at the sight of her, and it was the finest thing she had ever seen in her life. "Clara," Garrick said. His voice was a wreck, barely a whisper. "You made the train." "I made the train," she said, crossing to him, falling to her knees beside the bed, taking his rough hand in both her bandaged ones. "I made the train, Garrick. It's done. It's over. He's in irons. His own books hung him every figure just like I said. And the marshals are federal and he can't buy a single one of them, and he's going to answer for the Hendersons, and for all of it." The tears were streaming down her face, and she didn't care. "It's over. You did it. We did it. You did it," Garrick whispered. "I just drew off some riders." A ghost of his old dry humor moved across the ruined face, though I'll grant it was livelier than I bargained for. "You nearly died. I'm hard to kill." His fingers tightened weakly around hers. "Told you I'd keep my word. Said I had more to say to you. Said you was to come find me." His creek-water eyes held hers, and there was nothing tired in them now, nothing guarded, only a thing laid bare that a lonely man had guarded his whole life. "Well, you come and found me. So I reckon I'd best say it before I lose my nerve or my breath, whichever goes first." He drew a shallow, painful breath. "I have been alone on that mountain 20 years. Clara Whitmore and I told myself the whole time it was because I liked it, that I needed nobody, that the mountain was enough." His voice dropped rough and raw and honest. "It was a lie. I was just waiting. I didn't know for what till a woman got off a wagon in a mended dress and stood in the dirt and told a whole cruel town the truth of themselves without once raising her voice. And I got down off my horse, and I have not been alone one day since, not in here." His hand moved weakly toward his own bandaged chest. "And I don't ever want to be again. That's what I had to say. That's the whole of it." Clara pressed his hand to her wet face. "Then don't be," she whispered. "Don't ever be alone again, because I've been the last one standing my whole life, Garrick burying everyone I loved, one by one, and I made my peace with dying that way alone, unclaimed worth nothing to anybody." And then a mountain man got off his horse in a public square and said 4 words nobody else would say, and I found out the world had been lying to me for 3 years. Her voice broke and mended. "I'm not worth nothing. I never was. You proved it in front of the whole town. And I have loved you, I think, since that very first afternoon, since you told me the whole world had been treating me like I owed it something, and I didn't. I never did." She lifted her head and looked at him, and the last of the fear she'd carried since the winter of the graves, went out of her for good and all. "So no, you won't be alone again. Neither of us will. That's finished. That's the one thing in this whole world I am certain of." And Garrick Hayes, too weak to lift his head, smiled the full smile that took 10 years off him, the one she'd seen only twice before, and he said, "Well, all right then." The same words he'd said the first day when she'd rolled up her sleeves in his kitchen, and Clara laughed through her tears, and outside the window, the valley of Red Hollow was beginning at long last to come back to life. The reckoning that followed was long, but it was just, and Clara saw every part of it through. Silas Carver was tried in the federal court at Miles City, and Clara Whitmore was the star witness against him, and she sat in that courtroom in a new dress the Valley women had sewn for her, and she recited his own ledgers from memory for 2 full days, while the prosecutor matched every word to the seized books and there was not a thing his expensive lawyers could do against a witness who did not forget, and a confession in the defendant's own hand. The hired man, Coyle, taken alive by the marshals with a marshal's bullet in his leg, turned on his master to save his own neck, and testified to the Henderson barn, and that was the end of any hope Silas Carver had. He was convicted on all counts: the fraud and the bribery and the murder of 4 souls, and the smiling grandfather, who had believed he owned a whole valley and mistook it for the whole world, was sentenced to hang, and he learned at the last, as small kings always do, that there was a bigger law than the one he'd bought. And Delphine Carver testified too. That was the bravest thing Clara witnessed in the whole affair, braver even than her own long night. Delphine stood up in that courtroom, the murderer's own daughter, and told what she had heard through a study door when she was 14 years old, and gave up her father and her name and her fortune and her fine cage all at once in the open before the world. Clara sat and watched the girl she'd found weeping in a sitting room stand straight-backed and clear-voiced and testify against the man who'd made her, and she thought there it was, her church square, and she stood up in it. When it was over, Delphine came to Clara, pale and free and utterly adrift, a woman who had burned down her whole life for the truth and did not know what came next. "I have nothing now," Delphine said. "The estate's forfeit. My name's a curse in 3 territories. I don't know a single thing about how to live like an ordinary person. I gave it all up and I'd do it again. But Clara, I don't know where to go. I don't know who I am without him to define me." And Clara Whitmore took the younger woman's hands the way she had in that sitting room. "You're the woman who stood up," she said. "That's who you are. And you'll come up the mountain with us until you find out the rest. And there's a valley full of families getting their land back this month who'll never forget it was Silas Carver's own daughter who helped bring him down. You won't want for friends here, Delphine. Not anymore. You bought your place in this valley the same way I did, by standing up when it cost you everything. The land came back." That was the thing Clara was proudest of in the years after. The federal court unwound every stolen deed, and one by one the ruined families came back to their farms, and the widows got their homes. And Widow Ames reopened her boarding house and never once let Clara pay for a meal in it as long as she lived. And Clara's father's claim, the 160 acres on the mussel shell that had started the whole thing, the keepsake she'd carried 3 years without a thought, proved out to be worth exactly the fortune Silas Carver had killed to get when the railroad came through the following spring. Clara gave half of it away. She divided it among the Henderson kin who'd survived distant cousins back east, and among the families who'd suffered worst under Carver, and she kept enough to build a proper house on the mountain beside Garrick's cabin, and to found something the valley had never had and badly needed. A school. A real school for every child in the valley. The ranchers' children and the poor children and the children of families that had nearly lost everything. And Clara Whitmore taught in it herself. Numbers, mostly because she believed to the end of her days that a child who could read a column of figures could never be cheated. The way that Valley had been cheated could never be told they were worth nothing by a man with better clothes and a crueler heart. She and Garrick married in the spring in the church square at Red Hollow, in the very spot where a groom had once laughed at her before 30 silent strangers. It was not a silent square that day. The whole valley came, every family she'd helped, and every family that had helped her, and Widow Ames wept in the front row, and Delphine Carver stood up as Clara's own witness, and when the minister asked who gave this woman half the valley, answered at once, and the sound of it rolled up the street and off the mountains. And Garrick Hayes, healed now, but for a stiffness in his shoulder that never fully left, stood at the front in a proper coat that Clara had made him buy, uncomfortable as a cat in a creek, and when she came down the aisle to him, he forgot every bit of his discomfort, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her from the bed in Doc Pearson's back room, like she was the finest thing he'd ever seen, and the only thing he'd ever waited for. "You clean up all right, Mr. Hayes," Clara murmured, taking her place beside him. "Ma'am," Garrick said low, just for her, "you are the most beautiful thing that ever stood in this square, and every soul here that saw the other day knows it, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure not one of them ever forgets it." And Clara Whitmore, who had come to this square broken and been made whole, looked up at the quiet man who had gotten down off his horse when no one else would. And she knew with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had counted the cost of everything, and found this one thing beyond all price, that the world had been wrong about her, and the town had been wrong about her, and Nathaniel Brooks and Silas Carver, and 3 long years of grief had all been wrong about her, and only one man had been right. They lived a long life on that mountain, the 2 of them, and it was a good one. The school grew and took in children from 3 counties before Clara was through, and there were those who came back as grown men and women years later and said that Clara Hayes's insistence that they learn their figures had saved their farms and their families more than once from the sharp practice of men who traded on ignorance. The valley prospered honestly the way Silas Carver had always claimed to want and never meant. And on winter evenings in the good house beside the old cabin, Garrick would sit by the fire mending tack while Clara kept the books, not just their own now, but half the valley's, the way she had that very first week. Because the whole of Red Hollow had learned there was one person in the territory who could look at a column of numbers and find the lie hidden in it, and that she would never ever use that gift to cheat a soul. She lived to be an old woman. Clara Hayes did older than she'd ever thought a body left as alone as she'd once been could hope to live. And when she was very old, and the young people of the valley would ask her to tell the story, the famous story, the one their grandparents had all witnessed, of the wagon bride and the mountain man and the fall of Silas Carver, she would tell it to them true, all of it, the church square and the claim and the hidden ledger and the black gorge in the dark. But she always ended it the same way, and it was never the part about the courtroom or the railroad or the fortune. It was always the same small moment, the one that mattered most to her out of the whole of her long and finally happy life. There were 30 people in that square the day my groom laughed at me, she would tell them, her old eyes bright. 30 decent, ordinary, God-fearing people, and every last one of them stood and watched a woman get treated like she was worth nothing, and not one of them said a word. And I want you to understand something, all of you, because it's the truest thing I know, and I'll not be here forever to tell you. She would lean forward, and her voice, though old, would carry the way it had carried across that square so long ago. It doesn't take a crowd to change the world. It never has. It takes exactly one person willing to do the decent thing when everyone else stays silent. One person who gets down off the horse. Her eyes would find Garrick old and gray beside her, still quiet, still hers. I know, because I was worth nothing to the whole world, until one man decided I was worth getting down off a horse for. And that one man, and those 4 words he said, were the beginning of everything good that ever came to this valley. So don't you ever wait for the crowd. Don't you ever tell yourself it's not your affair. When you see someone treated as less than they are, you be the one. You be the one who stands up, because the whole world can change on it. Mine did. And that was the story of Clara Whitmore, who crossed 600 miles to be laughed at in the dirt, and who rose from it to bring down a murderer free a valley and build a life worth more than all the stolen gold in Montana. She was told she was worthless by the man who was supposed to love her in front of a town that stayed silent. And she proved every one of them wrong, not with beauty, not with luck, not by being rescued, but with the sharpest mind in the territory and a heart that refused to break. The world tried to tell Clara Whitmore she was nothing, and Clara Whitmore spent the rest of her life proving to every soul who ever needed to hear it that a person's worth is never decided by the ones who look away, but by the ones who stand up and by the strength they carry within, and no man alive has ever had the power to take that truth from a single living soul.